Hello and welcome to a Conquest, the Last Argument of Kings list review and analysis video for the World Championships 2025 happening soon in Chios in Greece. List submission by qualifying players for the event closed only a few days ago, and after checking all of the lists, Parabellum have been good enough to post them online, which means we can sit down, review, critique, and talk about all of them ahead of the event. Now, before we jump in, just a few things, what we'll be talking about and some caveats with regards to this video. We will be covering, firstly, the faction breakdown, what we will be talking about in terms of lists, how many different players there are for each faction, but then diving into each individual list for analysis and critique. Now, while we are going to be critical and talk about how well the lists fit into the metagame that has emerged at Chios, how well positioned they are to perform, I want to be absolutely clear. No matter what I might say about any of these lists, every single player at Chios is a Worlds qualifying player. They worked hard, they practiced, they've given a lot of thought to this game. We have the luxury of sitting here and looking at all of these lists after seeing all of them in full. All of these players had to predict and respond to the conditions at Chios without the benefit of that same amount of information. As such, just in case there is any doubt, please let me say in advance that every player present at this event is worthy of respect and is a very strong player of Conquest. Good luck to all of them. Now, just briefly, another little note. While we will obviously be talking about how each of these lists is positioned to perform at the Chios metagame, this video won't be a full breakdown of the current metagame at Conquest at large. However, shameless self-promotion, if you are interested in reading a long-form article covering all of that content, there is a link there on the video to an article that I wrote for Goonhammer covering in depth basically how Conquest stands heading into Chios. Now, faction count for the event. Not necessarily any huge surprises here. There are 16 players traditionally at Chios overall, which means the expected count per faction is 1 to 2 players per faction, but that will always vary based on who qualified and what is popular. In this case, we can see a very large count of Yoroni, comprising a quarter of the field, and similarly large counts of Sorcerer Kings and Wadhrun, but with no Spires or City-States players, and neither of those is really a surprise. Spires are a faction that just have not really mechanically kept up with Conquest over time, and who are very much waiting for a faction update that might be arriving as early as January or February next year. And City-States, while they are broadly a very good faction, kind of have a chronic chariot dependency that is very maladaptive into the metagame that has kind of emerged in Conquest. There are lots of regiments in the game right now that have some combination of evasion and tenacious, often tenacious 2 against ranged attacks or just tenacious 2 generally, and as good as chariots are, and they are absolutely in a vacuum an exceptional regiment, they just don't get to kind of influence and control the pace of the game against that kind of opponent. And city-states are kind of in a position where they're trying to figure out what they should be doing if they aren't taking faction defining units like chariots. And I would guess that of the players present who had the option of playing city-states, and there was at least one, I do believe the former world champion won Chios last year with city-states. Those players have obviously made the decision that on the balance of probabilities, their best chance running into Chios this year is not to try and make city-states work, it is to change faction and pick something that is strong in the current metagame. That happens in a lot of wargames. There is no personal obligation on a person to have loyalty to a particular faction or be a faction main. And especially right now, at the top end of competition, seeing someone put city-states aside for a year and pick up Sorcerer Kings, for example, is not a hugely surprising outcome. Now, despite the fact that the faction count at Chios is weighted towards Yoroni and Sorcerer Kings and to an extent Wadrun, just remember, particularly if you are a viewer who's watching this content with an interest in but not as a player of Conquest, Conquest is a living game. It is updated 3 times a year, and its developers actively monitor and are involved with the community. And so there is a very strong expectation that as soon as this season ends and the World Championship concludes, on something like the 18th of September, the next balance patch will be released, and it is almost certain to address, for example, some of the most powerful elements in factions like Yoroni or Sorcerer Kings. Now, with that, let's start jumping into the 16 lists that are on display at Chios this year. These are going to be grouped by factions, and we're going to start with Yoroni because they are the most populous faction at the event. Now, when I did this video last year, we just followed along directly from the army-generated PDFs. I've decided not to do that this year, mostly because there are 4 Yoroni players. That's a quarter of the field, and if you have ever seen what an army-generated PDF for a Yoroni list looks like, you will understand why I have chosen to transcribe all of the lists into PowerPoint, because I'm not inflicting that on myself or on you. Now, that does mean that some detail might be lost, because my transcription of the list is a little high level, but I'll try and talk through what each of these regiments does. And of course, you can always follow along with Army Open yourself as you're watching this. So, our first Yoroni player is one of the USA players, Carl Swanson. Carl is a former Chios attendee, and this year he is playing Yoroni. Now, his list has 3 warbands, but in practice there are only 2 of them with any regiments other than the character. The first is an Oyabun warband, and this warband has 2 medium-sized regiments of Tengu Ayakashi. Those are the ranged bird Oni, and then a very large regiment led by a Kami. That's 3 Kami, 1 Oni, and 1 Origami warrior. The Oyabun himself has Trial of Hakari Ishi, which will give Tenacious +1 to the regiment, and he will be joining that Kami regiment, which will have, as a result of the Kami command stand, Tenacious 2. Now, this kind of setup is going to be repeated across all of the Yoroni lists that we will be seeing, and it is, frankly, a significant part of the strength of Yoroni in the current metagame. The list punches on, or the regiment rather, punches on very well. It's dangerous, it has an Oni stand, the Oyabun himself is no slouch, it's got some Kami for trample. It is not an absolute world beater in terms of the damage that it puts out, but it is an absolute world beater in terms of the damage that it can sustain. Because the regiment is Tenacious 2, thanks to the Trial of Hakari Ishi, and because it has very high resolve, in part thanks to the Chi card that they can draw and activate with, and because it just has so many regiments, so many wounds, this is a 34 wound regiment, then even unsupported, it can just sustain a tremendous amount of damage. And if you come at this regiment half-cocked, you are just going to waste your attacks. And it is absolutely dangerous enough to gobble up MSUs and continue on its path, which means that this regiment in particular, among a number of regiments in this list, needs to be approached with just absolute caution. Now, it's going to be supported by the Jorogomu Mahotsu, which is one of these spider demons, monster, large, intimidating, and importantly, a spellcaster with 2 extremely powerful spells. She has a spell that can give +1 defense to any regiment. It does not have scaling. It can easily be cast on any of the big important regiments in this list, getting them to defense 4, which is an even larger force multiplier on top of their existing defenses, or she has a spell that if it succeeds, again no scaling, just heals for 4. Because she has a free additional spell cast, and because she is not subject to the usual limitation when a spellcaster has that rule of not being able to repeat the same spell, she can potentially heal 2 regiments or give 2 different regiments +1 defense. She's a very powerful support piece in addition to just being a big and durable monster. Our next proper warband consists of a Kitsune Bakasu, who is the Warlord. She is going to be the most popular Warlord that we will see for Yoroni. She's not going to be the only Warlord. There is at least one list that uses an Oyabun Warlord. But the Kitsune Bakasu basically fixes threat extension for Oni. She lets 1 regiment per round, activated with a Fu card, benefit from fluid formation, and once per game lets any regiment be activated with a Fu card. That means that once per game, that large dangerous Kami block can use fluid formation for massive threat extension, and the regiment that she is in can use it every turn because she will be able to activate it with Fu as she is a Fu character, or rather, she can draw Fu, apply the effect, and then when it activates it will get fluid formation. She is going to be in a regiment of 4 Origami warriors and 1 Kappa, and this is an exceptionally durable, exceptionally dangerous early game regiment. Its wound count is a little lower and its resiliency is a little lower than the Kami block, but it does natively have defense 3, and it does natively have Tenacious 2 against volleys, just not against melee attacks. It has lethal demise on all of the Origami warriors, it benefits from the Kitsune Bakasu's resolve, and while Origami warriors themselves are not particularly dangerous, the Kitsune and the Kappa will amply supplement the list's damage output, which means that unit rather gets to arrive as a light regiment and then just kind of bully off of the power of that flexibility. It's tough, it's dangerous, and it has a really long threat range to capitalize on both of those, thanks to the Kitsune just being able to give it fluid formation round after round. If it runs into trouble, then the Jorogumu can arrive to support it, can give it defense 4, can give it healing, and that three-pronged power of the Oyabun's unit, the Kitsune's unit, and then the Jorogumu is kind of the core of this list. There are 3 more regiments in the Kitsune's warband, 2 Tengu Bushi, these are melee birds, and then 1 Domaru Damashi regiment, these are the samurai. The suits of hollow armor, much less durable than most of the other regiments in the list, but very dangerous, and another light regiment to supplement the Origami Warriors. Now, sort of as you can see in the notes I have there, and you'll see these notes for every list, this is basically the platonic ideal of a competition Yoroni list, and I would expect nothing less from Carl. It is durable, it is very threatening in the early game and the mid game. It runs out onto the board very effectively thanks to Vanguard on almost all of the medium MSUs. Flank on the Oyabun, you can auto on the Jorogomo if you need to, so its board presence develops quickly. And because both of the characters count as 3 scoring stands, it bullies its way onto zones very effectively, and the Kitsune is making the Origami Warriors a scoring regiment, even though they are light. So it really isn't behind it all in scenario, it's often ahead and really able to contest just about any other list in the game in terms of early scenario presence, and then follow up with resilience that is just really difficult to match. I would also note that Carl hasn't kind of overstretched himself here in terms of the card mechanic in Yoroni. This list's card setup is quite clean. It's got 3 different cards that can activate the units. It's got Chi, Fu, and Mu. It's not trying to do something like add an Oni regiment in, which might be cool and dangerous, but would add a car card that would have to be managed. It's limiting itself to just the 3, which makes it easier to play, especially at a high stakes event like Chios. Now, in terms of critique to offer of this list, I think the only thing I can really say is that because this list is the platonic ideal of competition Yoroni, it is relying extremely heavily on that strength. It isn't, for example, tailored for the mirror match. Things like the Tengu Ayakashi in the mirror match are likely to be a little bit diminishing return, despite being a very good regiment on their merits. And in general, this list is just likely to be something that, in broad terms, many of the players will have been thinking about ahead of the event. Basically, this is going to be the most countered list at the event. It's just very possible that it is strong enough to muscle through those attempts to counter it on raw mechanical strength. We are going to see just an absolute ton of lists over the course of the rest of this video that have some kind of an adaptation that accounts for the existence of lists exactly like the one Carl is playing, but which may not necessarily manage to meet that standard in any case just because of how strong this is. It is very well put together, it is very well configured, it has no fat at all, and it is an extremely serious contender. Our second list comes from Nicholas Armlinger, and by the way, apologies in advance, particularly to the Polish players. I am almost certainly going to mispronounce a lot of names over the course of this video. I come from a country that has a place called Mount Kosciuszko, and if anyone in the audience knows the historical personage for whom that mount is named, they probably winced as hard as I did at that pronunciation. There's not much I can do to help it, but I hope Nicholas in this case is the correct pronunciation. Now, Nicholas is running a list that shares a lot of DNA with the list we just saw from Carl, quite a lot of common elements, but which plays wider in an attempt to get up to 11 activations. So it's running from left to right a Jorogumu Mahotsu, that's the spellcasting spider, with 2 regiments of Tengu Ayakashi, the ranged birds. It then has, again, a Kitsune Bakasu Warlord. She's the one in this case with Trial of Hikari Ishi because she will be joining the Kami Regiment, and that is the exact same Kami Regiment as the one that Carl is using. That's 3 Kami, 1 Kappa, and 1 Origami Warrior, a big, deep pool of wounds. The Origami Warrior always dies first because it has lethal demise and is the easiest to heal back. Lots of damage. The reason why I think I like the Kitsune here in general terms, but there is some risk associated with it, is that the Kitsune adds a lot more danger to that Kami regiment than the Oyabun does. She's just more dangerous than the Oyabun in absolute terms, with the only significant risk to her damage output being in the mirror match when she's going into another Tenacious 2 regiment. She falls off a lot there because Deadly Blades is something that you'll always use Tenacious to stop. But outside of the mirror match, provided you are willing to accept the loss of flank, and I think this list can do that, she rounds out and offers the most flexibility to that Kami block than sort of the competing options. Per warband rounds out with 2 more units of Damaru Damashi, so there are 2 units of Damaru Damashi in this list rather than 1 in Karl's list. And then rather than an Oyabun, the fact that the Kitsune Bakusu is going into the Kami brick in this list means that you do still need a Chi character in order to access Trial of Hakari Ishi, but because Nicholas is willing to give up Oyabun providing flank, he's able to make his Chi character the much more dangerous Daimyo, which in this case is joining a 3-man regiment of Origami warriors. Now, this is going to be less dangerous than Karl's equivalent regiment. It doesn't have the Kitsune in it. The Daimyo is about as dangerous as the Kitsune, but Karl's regiment has an entire extra Kappa stand, so this is a concession that's being made, but the concession is effectively affording, along with just a few tweaks here and there, an entire extra Damaru Damashi regiment, and Damaru Damashi are good and dangerous. They make this list have a whole extra activation in the early game, and they get it up to 11 activations overall. The Daimyo's warband is rounded out with 2 units of Tengu Bushi, so very similar in that case to Karl's regiment. We can see 2 different regiments of birds, 2 with bows, 2 with swords, providing extreme mobility, good damage output, vanguard, just all of the combination of speed and power that those regiments offer. Now, notwithstanding the absence of flank, which is a significant point of differentiation, the big change that we see here relative to the platonic ideal Yoroni list is that it manages to stretch itself up to 11 activations, and that can actually produce some very significant effects. There is a phenomenon that I call localized activation advantage, which is basically that your list may not have more activations than your opponent in total, but if they arrive at the right time, then you can still have more activations when it matters in that positional setup and first and second charge portion of the game. That's the point of the game when having just like 1 or 2 more activations than your opponent can make a really big difference on turn 2 and turn 3 as regiments are posturing. And being able to always have the last unit to go can make a really big deal. And this list of all of the Yoroni lists has amongst the best chance of just squeaking out that localized activation advantage in the early game. And especially when we get to the 100 Kingdoms list that is present this year, which is really a quite dedicated Yoroni hate list, what we'll see with that list is that it is built to go over the top of the activation count. It gets to a pseudo 12 activation count, which is more than this list we see here. It doesn't get them onto the board quickly. And especially if the reinforcement rolls are even remotely one-sided, that is possibly going to produce a situation where Nicholas has control over when and how the early engagements take place, and against that kind of high mobility 100 Kingdoms list is going to be a very big deal. Now, while I think the extra activation here is likely to pay dividends, it is worth noting that there are corners being cut to get up to that 9th regiment on the board. The Daimyo's Origami Warrior Regiment in particular does not have any way to access a Fu card for fluid formation until the Kitsune Bakusu has been on the board for a turn and can use Mistress of the Azure Gales, her active supremacy. That means it needs to posture much more carefully. It can't exert the same kind of pressure as if the Kitsune was in that regiment. And it's going to need to rely on the fact that it's accompanied by a larger number of Damaru Damashi to posture in the early game while the rest of the list arrives. Now, you could very easily pull back toward the platonic ideal version of this list just by moving the Kitsune into the Origami Warriors, moving the Daimyo into the Kami Regiment, and shifting your attention toward the early game. It's been a conscious decision by Nicholas not to, and so there's going to need to be an element of him managing that and using the fact that he has a larger light presence and a strong activation count in the early game to use activation control rather than threat range to manage that early positioning and engagement piece. Overall, though, this is a good list, and I think in terms of the broader Chios metagame, there is also something that is particularly worth noting, which is that Damaru Damashi are a regiment of like very inconsistent durability. If you can spool up on a Damaru regiment with offensive spellcasting, particularly before the Joraguma arrives, they can absolutely crumble. However, the same can't be said of any attempt to bring them down with volley fire, where native Tenacious 2 against volleys just makes them far more durable than their points cost would indicate. And in the lists that have emerged at Chios, even with 3 Sorcerer Kings players, I don't know if there is anyone that really wants to try and use offensive spellcasting to down Damaru Damashi. The Dwegom list isn't built to do it, the 100 Kingdoms lists aren't built to do it, and those would be the usual candidates. And so Basically, by accident or design, this double Damaru configuration really only needs to worry about aggressive melee picks, not the usual weakness of Damaru, which is that they can be very vulnerable to ranged spellcasting if your opponent is prepared for them. That's going to be a point in Nicholas's favor, as is just the general strong, powerful mechanical strength of the Yoroni list that he's playing, which varies only a little bit from the Platonic Ideal list. Now, considerably more experimental and very exciting is this Poland list from Camel. Now, this list in general makes use of the Sui card activation effect, and although this is something that I have seen theorized actually quite a bit since the last balance update, no one that I have seen had been able to make it work basically until this. Now, there are some compromises and some risks in this list, but despite that, it is able to make really heavy use of the Sui card. What the Sui card does is that it allows the regiment to change the stand that is providing the leader effect, and we'll talk about how that can be used over the course of the different units. Now, we'll actually work from right to left here because it is that rightmost regiment, the daimyo, that is the most important. This is a Sui daimyo, which means that it adds a Sui card and can be activated with the Sui card. It has the Trial Havakari Ishi, and it is in a regiment that is attempting to meld the strength of the origami unit and the kami unit in a really interesting way. So this list, firstly, this is just a massive regiment. This is 5 origami warriors and a kami and a tengu bushi and the daimyo, which means it is 8 stands, and because these are oni stands, that's terrifying, like outstanding. Now, by itself, that would be interesting. Oh, cool, it's an origami blob. Right, fair enough. Where is the Kami blob? But this unit is also trying to be the Kami blob because it has access to the Sui card. What it can do is at any given time when the Daimyo activates with Sui, it can pick either the Kami or the Tengu to be the command stand. Why would you pick the Tengu to be the command stand? Well, on the round that you arrive onto the table, round 1, you can make the Tengu Bushi be the command stand and give the regiment Vanguard 4. In subsequent rounds, if you think you need to, you can make the Kami regiment become the leader and give the regiment Tenacious 1. That will combine with Trial of Akari Ishi to be Tenacious 2. Now, you don't necessarily have to do that. The Origami Warrior command stand gives you Tenacious 2 against volleys in any case, but as combat is beginning to be joined, exchanging Tenacious 2 against volleys for Tenacious 2 period basically lets you play the Kami blob arriving as a light regiment with Vanguard 4. That is very aggressive. Now, the compromise of that regiment is that the only really dangerous model in it is the daimyo. The daimyo is very dangerous. He has good clash, high attacks, high cleave. But the Tengu Bushi is the next most dangerous thing, and without being in a pure Tengu Bushi list regiment, it only gives flawless strikes on 1s. It doesn't flawless strikes on 1s and 2s, which is what makes Tengu Bushi so powerful. And the entire rest of the regiment is just origami warriors. There are a lot of them, but as noted, they are not hugely dangerous. Nevertheless, as kind of an innovation, as a regiment that can get onto the board like more aggressively with more power in one piece than anything else in the entire game, certainly than is appearing on Chios, this is a really cool innovation. Now, continuing from right to left, we then have an Oyabun in a regiment of 3 Kappa and an Origami Warrior. And it's in this regiment that we can sort of start to see some of the concessions be made. Kappa are absolutely a nice and well-rounded stand. They have 7 wounds like everyone else. They are defense 3, they'll get the Oyabun's Resolve and the Oyabun's Chi card activation. But unless this regiment gets Jorogumu support, it is not going to be on the same level as like the Kami blob, because it's the origami brick that's trying to do that in this list. Now, something that I think that is worth noting about the Kappabushi is that they provide actually an important element of redundancy here in terms of being a regiment that can be given fluid formation by the Kitsune Bakusu Fu card Warlord effect. And that is because the Kappa Bushi, their command stand ability, is that they can receive the benefits of any ideal card. Now, under normal circumstances, that's okay, that's fine. There are absolutely more powerful and mechanically direct command stand abilities in Oni, but as we move on to the next warband, the Kitsune Bakusu warband, we can see why that might be relevant, because the Kitsune Bakusu only has a selection of MSUs to join. She's got 2 Tengu Bushi, 2 Tengu Ayakashi, 3 Damaru Damashi, and 2 Kappa. Now, I think most likely she'll be appearing in the Damaru Damashi regiment. Among other things, that really adds a lot of power to the early game push, right? One of the things that that will do if she's in the Damaru Damashi is give you a second light scoring regiment because there is characters in each of those light regiments. But the more important thing is that she can move up in support of the Daimyo's regiment. And if for any reason it finds itself engaging something and needs support, as much as that seems a little bit weird because it is such a powerful regiment, but if it runs, for example, into another origami blob, then the Kitsune's unit is present to be able to get fluid formation, move to support, very long threat range with 4 stands and fluid and the Damaru speed, etc. Damaru benefit hugely from the extra stand and fluid formation. It's just that that regiment is fragile. It's really, really good, but it's fragile. The Kitsune is at risk of death, and you don't want to be losing access to the extremely powerful once per turn fluid formation effect. And so you need at least one other regiment in the list that's not just like a Tengu MSU that can benefit from the Fu card. Where do we find that? By going back to the Kappabushi regiment. The Oyabun with his 3 Kappabushi and 1 Origami warrior can always be activated with Fu, even if the Kitsune is dead, and that gives Camel the option to play her more aggressively, to potentially expose her to risk without giving up a really important level of threat extension that is sort of critical to how this kind of list functions. Finally, and of course, we have the Jorogumu Mahotsu, the only regiment that is common across every single one of these lists. Actually, I tell a lie, there are lots of regiments that are common, but one of the unifying themes and one of the very, very powerful things about Yoroni. Now, this list is a list that is going to be difficult to assess the performance of, because it is taking some risks to be different. I think the big challenge that is going to confront this player in this particular case is that this is the most mechanically complex Yoroni list of the 4 that we will see. It concentrates force in very different ways. It is more resilient in some places, but less resilient in others. It is very contingent on good card ordering and getting the card effects out in the right place in the right time in a way that the Platonic Ideal list kind of isn't quite as much. And while Chios is only 4 rounds, which is not an extremely long event, it is nevertheless Worlds, which means that it is tremendously mentally draining. And so while I think Camel's list honestly wins my prize for coolest and most inventive Yoroni list that we are going to see at this event, I do think he's going to put himself at the risk basically just of extreme mental load over the course of the event. The flip side is that he's going to ship some of that to his opponents because this list is not the Platonic Ideal. Because this list is one that actually not many people, apart from Camel's immediate practice partners, are likely to have practiced against, it's going to present at least a little bit of a novel problem. It's just a question of whether that novelty is going to inflict more of a mental load on Camille over the course of 4 rounds than his opponent. Either way, this is one I'm very interested to watch the performance of and see how well it does. Our 4th and final Yoroni list is the one Australian player at the event, Saxon King. And this is another list that begins with the idea of the Yoroni Platonic Ideal competition list, but varies it. But where the previous list went light, this list has gone heavy. It's gone very heavy in point of fact. If not in terms of weight class, then in terms of sheer presence on the table. Now, there are a few ways that this list differentiates itself. The first is that it is the only Oni list not to have a Kitsune Bakasu at all, which means no Kitsune Bakasu Warlord. Instead, we have an Oyabun. It has the Trial of Hikari Ishi, that is in every single one of these lists, and for good reason. He is in a regiment of 4 Kami and 1 Kappa, so we see basically that same kind of build, where you have a very powerful, in this case, 35 wound regiment benefiting from the buffs from the Jorogumu, the Tenacious 2 from the Kami Command Stand and Trial. Now, where this list differs is that, whereas all of the other examples of this regiment will have at some point during the game at least one round of access to fluid formation for threat extension and just general flexibility, in this case the Oyabun is the Warlord, which means that every round one regiment activated by the Chi card, which most rounds will just be the Oyabun's regiment, but once per game could be something else, will benefit from Hardened One and Oblivious. And that, coupled with the Jorogumu, means that this regiment, of all of the Oni regiments, is potentially the most durable because it can get to Defense 4 Hardened 1. When we look at some of the counters that will emerge to Yoroni, this is only going to be of sort of moderate utility in the Sorcerer Kings matchup, but against 100 Kingdoms, and against Wadhrun, and against Dwegom, Hardened 1 is an extremely live ability, and it's also very relevant in the Oni Mirror matchup. The other regiment that we have in the Oyabun's Warband is a Daiokai, and this is the sort of weirdest thing about this list. The Daiokai is a heavy monster regiment, and it is in fact the only heavy that is appearing in any of the Yoroni lists. It is a solidly satted monster. It's actually a little bit more fragile than a Juragumu, but it has Vanguard, which means it gets up the board very quickly once it arrives. And while its signature ability looks like it's the Weeaboo Step rule that lets it move through regiments and attack as it goes, the actual really important thing here is that it's just a monster that can declare a free duel. Now, the emergence of Yoroni just in general has kind of highlighted how much duels are still a live mechanic, because Yoroni characters almost universally are durable enough to easily survive at least one round of dueling against another character, and dangerous enough to threaten to kill many other characters in one round in a duel. But even Yoroni characters don't really want to accept a duel against a 12 attacks inspired Clash 4 Cleave 1 Terror 1 monster regiment, and while that's a small vulnerability, it is still an exploitable vulnerability in the mirror match. The Daiokai is also another regiment that can always each round get to defense for Hardened 1, because he can be activated by Chi, but just kind of like overall, that's the tech, basically. This guy represents an interesting threat to other monsters because all of the monsters in Yoroni lists are characters. He represents a threat to the Yoroni blobs, not necessarily because he can really significantly harm them, but because he can reduce their resolve and make them non-scoring. And as a total package, 230 points is actually not hugely expensive. That's about the same cost as a 3-stand regiment of other Yoroni. He's not a huge impost on the list, and although he is a heavy, he is the only heavy in this list, which means he will always be arriving on turn 3. The other things that set this list apart are the fact that it doesn't have one Joragumi Mahotsu. It's got two, and they're disgusting. Each of them has a warband of one MSU of Oni and one MSU of Tengu, one Tengu Ayakashi, one Tengu Bushi. This list is actually running 10 points down. It would have the opportunity to upgrade the Tengu Bushi to any of the 160-point regiments. But one of the things I know Saxon found in testing was that the second Tengu Ayakashi just weren't necessarily adding that much value, particularly given that this is a 9 activation list. Now, it is an 8 regiment list, but every regiment has to be pulling its weight when your activation count is that low. Now, the two Jorogumu have some interesting combined effects, but ultimately what you have here is a list that is trying to go defensively over the top, not just of the Yoroni mirror, but lists that are trying to deal to fight into the platonic ideal of the Yoroni mirror. The expectation is that there are going to be a lot of lists at Chios that are configured to handle basically Carl's list. But if you take those same lists and you tell them, actually, now there is a second Jorogumu, which means that there is a second potentially 8 healing points per round, a second two regiments that can be defense 4, and every round one of these regiments will be hardened 1, all of a sudden what you're hoping to present is a defensive bulwark that once again breaks the force economy that the Yoroni broke the first time they arrived with this Tenacious 2 blob. Now, the price for that is that it is giving up a lot of agency. It's a very cool concept, it's very interesting, and it is absolutely very powerful. The price is just that it is a low agency list. 9 activations is the lowest of any, frankly, that we've ever seen at an event like Chios, but certainly that we have seen this year, and it doesn't really have threat range extension. It's durable, it can take damage and heal that damage, but it does not have any reach. And so it is really trading on the aim of being able to just take a punch to the face, fake that off, and then fight a brawl, and therefore not need access to abilities like Fluid Formation that we can see in every single other Yoroni list. This is probably the most experimental of the 4 Yoroni lists, certainly alongside the list that we just saw that was making heavy use of the Sui card. It's a list that is going to kind of demand Saxon just be chill for 4 games, accept damage, weather that, endure through it, commit into the fights at times of his choosing, more often accept that it is going to be his opponents, right, who are able to dictate the terms of engagement, and just build and play the list in a way where that's not a debilitating issue. Now, I don't think that's a sure thing, but I do think it's a really cool idea, and I think it demonstrates a really interesting attempt to read and subvert the broader metagame to an extent that actually isn't necessarily present in that many other lists to that level at Chios. Now, with the Yoroni covered, we're going to get on into the Sorcerer Kings. And I will note that for these lists in particular, I am going to be perhaps a little bit more critical than is fair around how these lists are mechanically constructed, because they are, all three of them, quite one-dimensional. I am strongly of the opinion that Sorcerer Kings do not necessarily need to be built that one-dimensionally, and that you are absolutely sustaining a trade-off when you build a list in this way. Reducing the list's complexity makes it easier to play, and being easy to play is actually really important at a high-pressure event like Chios, but it is leaving some strength and flexibility on the table in pursuit of one-dimensional strengths. We'll get into that a little bit more as we go through the list, so let's start with the first of these lists, Kyle from the USA. All three of these lists will share many common elements. They will all be Court of Fire. They will all have a Maharaja Warlord. Kyle's list is MSUs as far as the eye can see. We have a Maharaja Warlord with the Court of Fire and Court of Air as his two courts, and taking Shulat as his artifact, which will help with ritual generation. His warband consists of 3 Ghouls, a regiment that he will be joining, and basically just hiding in for much of the game. Ghouls can absolutely commit into melee. They aren't quite as fragile as people used to think they are. And with the Maharaja's resolve, they can maybe sustain 1 hit some of the time. But in terms of damage output, actually they're quite sound. They are a strong recipient of Molten Blades because they have a good high attack count. The Maharaja himself is not a slouch in combat. And so in a pinch, if you have to commit this regiment into combat, you can. You can have the Maharaja cast Molten Blades, you can charge with the Ghouls, you can take a clash that is likely to do a fair bit of damage, but most of the time you will be trying not to do that. And the reason why is that the Air Court spell Homing Winds is important to how this list functions, and the Maharaja is just going to be hanging out trying to cast that spell for most of the game. Because, by God, there are a lot of Flamecasters in this list. The remainder of the Maharaja's warband is just 3 MSUs of Flamecasters. We then move on to the next warband, which is a Raj, again of Fire. He has the combination that we will see, I think, in all 3 of these lists, which is Bound to the Elements, and the Prism Kanja sword, weapon, something. That lets him join a Brute regiment, in this case it will be Sword Dancers. It also makes him one of the most dangerous melee combatant characters in the game. He has 9 attacks at Clash 3 with Flurry and Flawless Strikes, and he can give himself via a spell, Cleave 1 and Deadly Blades. That's just a tremendous amount of damage. Now he is expensive. That's a total package that I believe is more expensive than the regiment that he is joining, but the damage output is extreme. He'll be in a unit of 3 Sword Dancers, and then his warband is rounded out with another 3 Sword Dancers and 3 Ghouls. Finally, we have another 5 activation warband, a Sorcerer of Air, 3 Ghouls, 3 Ghouls, 3 Flamecasters, 3 Flamecasters. All of the Ghouls in this list are Court of Fire. Now, the Sorcerer is Court of Air. That is because Homing Winds is an extremely powerful spell. It is the most powerful ranged buff spell in the entire game. It's not close. It allows just full rerolls of all misses by a ranged regiment, and when you combine that with how the Flamecasters work, where if you trigger Inflamed, which is the unique mechanic for fire elementals, they will rapid volley on a 1 or a 2. When you throw rerolls into the mix of a regiment that is, yes, volley 2, potentially aiming, but is rapid volleying, that is to say generating additional hits on a roll of a 1 or a 2, rerolls are multiplicative on that in a way that they wouldn't be just on a normal volley. Flamecasters can have extreme spikes of performance as a result, and the presence of 2 air spellcasters is to enable those spikes of performance on at least 2 of these units each round. And it's kind of there that we get a little bit into my critique of this list, because, like, make no mistake, this is mechanically very, very powerful. But it is powerful in a way that I can best describe as it is the kind of list that is currently demolishing casual play and TTS events. That doesn't necessarily make it well adapted to Chios to the top end of the metagame. Now, yes, this list has 14 activations and can add rituals to its deck. It will add a lot of rituals to its deck because all of those regiments generate ritual tokens, and most of the wizards will in any given turn, kinda depending. And that's potentially going to let you get up to 17 activations in some rounds, and I am an extreme activation enjoyer. I am well aware of the power of that, but you are simply not going to get maximal results out of all of those Flamecaster regiments. You will get the potential for good performance from 2 of them each round. Of those 2, only one of them will have access to the possibility for triple activation, which is a big and important part of the threat range game of Sorcerer Kings. Flamecasters have a good threat range with March 6 and range 14, but having a whole extra March on top of that significantly improves that. And because of all of these things in combination, because some of these Flamecasters are invariably going to be leaving a little bit of money on the table, they will not be at maximal strength. And because they will not be at maximal strength, their damage will merely be okay. And we have just finished looking through an entire roster of Yoroni lists that have good defense, defense 4 in many cases, and tenacious 2 out the arse. This list risks putting itself in a position where in any given turn, a large number of its regiments are just not hugely combat effective. It's also, when we jump ahead to things like the 100 Kingdoms list that we'll see after this, the maximum attention this list is playing to MSUs to get a high activation count, it's paying off far in advance of what it needs to in anything other than maybe the Sorcerer King mirror. And to do that, it has to do things like bring the Sword Dancers regiment that the Raj is in down from a larger size. We will see 4 Sword Dancers in the other lists, down to 3 Sword Dancers. At that point, the Raj is more expensive than the regiment that he is joining. And if something dives that Sword Dancer unit looking for a kill, they've got a very good chance of getting it because 3 Sword Dancers are just 15 wounds at defense 3. That's not a Yoroni unit. And so collectively, what that means is that this list is leveraging the strengths of Fire Court very effectively. If it is subject to chip damage, it is going to be able to heal extremely effectively thanks to multiple uses of the Fiery Dominion ritual. It is going to have a very high activation count, and it's going to be able to use that activation count to set up late in turn plays. It's the highest activation count of any list at Chios. But it is kind of fundamentally a list that is built to blow up casual games at the local game store. It is the list that absolutely should get nerfed in the next balance update because it is extremely deleterious to that kind of casual play. But in competition play, every unit has to be extremely justified. Every unit needs to be getting the maximum amount of efficiency. Every unit needs to key into a list. You cannot make all of those Flamecaster regiments maximally strong. You cannot buff all of those Gold regiments with Molten Blades so that they're dangerous. And you cannot guarantee that the list outputs the damage or has the durability to survive in the Chios metagame, which is not trying to do bits and pieces of chip damage everywhere, which this list would trivialize. There are some Wadhrun lists that it will give a really bad time to. In fact, I think most of the Wadhrun lists this will give a really bad time to. But in terms of what Sorcerer Kings can be and the maximum effect that they can create, this is just, it is a very good list. And it is just a very good list, and for that reason I feel like I have to offer it some criticism, because Sorcerer Kings can absolutely be more dangerous than this. Now, the next list comes from La Villa Emanuele from Italy, and it goes some of the way toward making changes that bring this list more in line with something that is going to be adapted to the Chios metagame. Mostly. There are some things present here that I am concerned about. Now, much of the list is very, very similar. We have a Maharaja Warlord, he's in goals. There are a ton of Flamecasters. We have a Raj bound to the elements with Primkanja, he's in Sword Dancers. Compared to the previous list that we just saw, this list has 1 fewer Flamecasters and 1 more Sword Dancers. Sword Dancers are a more self-sufficient regiment. The difference between peak maximalized performance Sword Dancers and Sword Dancers unsupported is not nearly as high as the difference between Flamecasters at their maximum and Flamecasters unsupported. And the extra Sword Dancer count here helps maximize the force that the list is getting from the regiments that aren't being given the attention of rituals and spells. It also has a 4-strong Sword Dancer regiment that the Raj can join, which is 20 wounds, which can sustain a high resolve count for longer. It can sustain attention from powerful enemy regiments. It can much more reliably survive a clapback from a Yoroni brick or a dive from a 100 Kingdoms Knight regiment. And the only price that's really been paid for that is 1 fewer unit of ghouls than the USA list that we just saw. The thing that's maybe a little bit dubious about the configuration here, but which I don't want to overstate, is the presence of a Raj rather than a Sorcerer at the head of the final warband. The Raj is much more expensive than a Sorcerer. It's much more expensive because it's better in melee, but it doesn't have a volley attack, and it has flank. You really don't need to give flank to light regiments, guys. Now, I can tell from the fact that basically the way this list is configured, that relative to the previous list, the cut of a regiment of goals has afforded a few luxuries. One of those luxuries is Vizier of the Morning Star on the Maharaja, the other is the fact that a sorcerer can become the Raj. Now, Vizier of the Morning Star is actually a kind of interesting ability that rallies any of your broken regiments at the beginning of a round. Or, sorry, very specifically, at the end of the round, which is more powerful because it means that a broken regiment on a zone rallies prior to scoring. That kind of effect is pretty cool on its own merits, just in terms of securing scoring. And it can be quite good as an out of sequence rally when you consider how much healing can be done by Sorcerer Kings through multiple uses of the Fiery Dominion ritual every round. But I honestly cannot help but think that if you cut that and you turned the Raj into a sorcerer, you'd have 60 points spare. And 60 points just buys you a 5th Sword Dancer for that Raj's regiment. Or it turns goals into Maharabati. There are some very meaningful upgrades that you can get for 60 points. And so basically, if I was in Lavilla's shoes, I would want to be really certain that value was being gotten out of that Vizier of the Morning Star mastery every round, and I just don't think that's guaranteed. It's also worth noting that in comparison to Kyle's version of this list, that Raj is a Fire Raj, not an Air Raj, which means you have one less use of homing winds each round, and are instead getting more access to fire spells, which are fine. The Fire Court has very good spells, a good mix of offensive and defensive and damaging spells. Like, there's no issue at all with casting fire spells in this list, but when you think about the power of homing winds on a unit of flamecasters, I made the point that Kyle's list had more flamecasters than it could ever conceivably maximize the use of. It had one more Court of Air. So as much as Lavilla's list has one more Sword Dancer to be a self-sufficient regiment, that more easily bridges the gap between effective performance and peak performance, that ground that is gained by having just one more unit of sword dancers to fight with in melee is kind of lost again by not having access to an air court, a second air court spellcaster. Ultimately, that's a very minor thing, but I do definitely, I have concern about a very expensive 120 point Raj slapped in the middle of a 110 point unit of goals. And so basically for those reasons, in addition to many of the things I had to say about Kyle's list, I think this is a very good and mechanically powerful Sorcerer Kings list that is just not necessarily doing an optimized job at building itself for winning at Chios. Now, a notable exception to the trend that we have seen in the previous two Sorcerer Kings lists comes, kind of unsurprisingly, from Polish player Matthias. Those of you who might be unfamiliar with this name, Matthias is the player who won using city states. He won Worlds last year. He is the returning champion. I frankly expected no less than something like this from him, and he absolutely delivered. And what he delivers here is the only of the three Sorcerer Kings list that is actually properly optimized for the meta demands of Chios. And he's done that by really consciously adjusting how his list delivers force. We'll go through it and I'll talk about the significant changes. He is running a Maharaja Warlord. It is a Jadu Kavach Warlord. It's the first time we've seen Jadu Kavach, so fire and air. Jadu Kavach is the artifact that allows rerolls of 6s on spellcasting by spellcasters within a range of the Maharaja. That's a good artifact. It is very relevant in context of the key regiments in his warband. He's going to be in 3 goals. They arrive early, they help generate rituals, they can fight if they need to, but again, he's a very high value caster. Much of the time, he'll probably be trying to operate in a support capacity. In his warband, we have 3 sword dancers, but then 5 flamecasters and 5 flamecasters. To his left, we have once again a Raj, Fire, Bound to the Elements, and Primkanja. As with the previous list, this Raj is in a 4-strong unit of Sword Dancers, which is just liable to give it enough durability to make one more clash than it might if it was an MSU, and when you're paying that many points for an absolute blender of a character, you want to really make sure that you get every opportunity to deal as much damage with him as you can. We then have 3 Flamecasters. This means this is a list with only 3 Flamecaster regiments, and 2 of them are outsized. Then to the right we have an Air Sorcerer with Dancing Scimitar, 3 goals, and 3 Sword Dancers. Now, there are a number of pieces that interact here to make this list better suited to the demands of Chios, but the most important ones are those 5 strong Flamecaster regiments. When we go back and we look at all those Yoroni regiments, we can see tenacious and tenacious against range attacks everywhere. To overcome that efficiently, you need to really land a really high volume of attacks. To do that at range, you need more than just Flamecaster MSUs. So we have 5 strong regiments, which is basically the maximum effective width you can seriously expect to maneuver a ranged regiment at. And while being a regiment that size kicks in scaling purposes of casting homing winds, the Maharaja has Jadukavach just to help really guarantee that the 2 air spellcasters, that's the Maharaja and the Sorcerer, can pretty reliably get that buff off and deliver the amount of damage with these flamecasters that is needed to overcome the defensive elements present at Chios. Basically, what we have present here is a list that reads the room properly in terms of the force economy, right? The amount of force you will need to leverage on a unit by unit basis to succeed at Chios. Now, it makes compromises to get there. It is the lowest activation count of any of the Sorcerer Kings lists. It has the lowest scoring count of any of the Sorcerer Kings lists, has the least scoring regiments. But in exchange for those compromises, it is a list that can put enough damage out of individual regiments to firstly overcome enemy Sorcerer Kings healing in the mirror match, secondly be durable enough to potentially sustain through damage yourself from enemy Flamecaster regiments, and overcome Yoroni defenses. Now this list might run into some issues in the 100 Kingdom game. The 100 Kingdoms are actually up next, and there are some defenses 100 Kingdoms have in place that can potentially no-sell even those very powerful Flamecaster offenses. That will just have to be something that Matthias plays through. But despite that potential limitation, this list otherwise takes my pick as favorite from amongst the Sorcerer Kings just because it has clearly given so much more thought to the requirements it's going to have to meet to succeed at an event like Chios. Now, from Sorcerer Kings, we're going to jump order a little bit. We're going to skip over Wadhrun and come back to them, even though Wadhrun have more players than 100 Kingdoms, just because I think the 100 Kingdoms position themselves most interestingly in the context of both Yoroni and Sorcerer Kings. And one of the first things I'll just draw your attention to is the fact that there are 2 names up there at the top of the slide. This is the 100 Kingdoms list being effectively played by 2 different players. Andrew and Peter, both from the United States. And this is really just a showcase of the Team USA's internal coordination. The USA players will have workshopped lists together, they will have practiced together, and they will have come to the same conclusion. And as a result, while there are technically some very, very subtle differences between Andrew and Peter's list, for practical purposes and for the purposes of this video, the 2 lists are identical. And this list is particularly interesting because of how it tries to thread the needle between the demands of the Yoroni and the demands of the Sorcerer King matchup. Now, this is an Order Feudal Dynastic Alliance list with a Mounted Noble Lord as the Dynastic Ally or Warlord, and then a Priory Commander of the Crimson Tower as a Dynastic Ally or Warlord. We've got a Mounted Noble Lord, no special rules, just Weapon Master for Cleave 1. In one of the 2 lists he has Art of War. I think probably the better version is to have it on the Priory Commander of the Crimson Tower, which is the version we can see here. 3 Household Knights, 3 Household Knights, 3 Men-at-Arms, 3 Mounted Squires. He will be joining one of those 2 Household Knight regiments. They will probably be playing quite close to the other Household Knight regiments in order to spread the Mounted Noble Lord's feudal dynastic aura, which allows reroll clash rolls and armor rolls of 6. Now, rerolling armor rolls of 6 when your regiment is defense 3 with a shield is very powerful. And while it is not able to sustain an infinite amount of damage, it is able to no-sell an awful lot of attacks. Against something like a Flamecaster volley, you can think of that as effectively defense 4 and 2/3. That's how many saves you will make out of 6. And that sharply limits the incoming damage of anything except maybe Podwis's outsized regiments. Now, the Men-at-Arms are just a medium scoring regiment. They're 110 points. Their job is to be a medium reinforcement dice and then at some point in the game sit on its own. Even though they are technically an Orders regiment and therefore the command stand has flurry, fairly limited expectations of what they can accomplish. In a much wider Orders list, you can actually sometimes get some use out of smaller men-at-arms regiments, but in this particular case, I suspect their main role is to just be a scoring regiment and to be a reinforcement dice, and that's fine. We have one light regiment in this list, and it's Mounted Squires, which are one of the fastest light regiments in the entire game, and I think are the fastest light regiment that can set a reinforcement line. Now, it shouldn't necessarily be assumed that they will do that. How much you need a reinforcement line for a list like this is actually just really contingent on the demands of the scenario. There are two sealed temple regiments in this list. Both of them are very well suited to coming in off of a reinforcement line and seizing a zone, but it would be a mistake to assume that that's something the list would do every game that they play. Really, that's down to the demands of the scenario, and you could actually have situations where, in order to just preserve your deployment options, you keep the Mounted Squires off the board and bring them on later where they can be an opportunist regiment. Ultimately, they are an inexpensive unit that exists to support much larger and more powerful key pieces, and we see those in the Orders regiments. And so we have two similar but not identical warbands, both led by Priory commanders of the Crimson Tower. One of the two is much lighter. It has 3 Crimson Tower, which you must take as they're the only mainstay that the Crimson Tower Priory can have, and then 3 Sealed Temple. The Priory Commander will always be joining the Sealed Temple, and he is a significant force multiplier on that unit. Sealed Temple by themselves are actually not hugely dangerous. They have 4 impact attacks, that's fine, but like no special rules, no brutal or anything like that. They have 4 clash attacks, that's fine, their clash is good, but they would be a very, very expensive regiment if that was the only way by which you measured them. What makes them really good is that they are speed 8 and have fluid formation and a standard bearer, which gives them extreme threat ranges and extreme mobility. They just need something to give them punch to capitalize on them. And the minimum way of doing that, like the best way of doing that without breaking the bank on expanding the unit out, is to take a Priory Commander and add him to the regiment. Because the Priory Commander has terror, as long as he is in contact with an enemy, effectively all of their attacks benefit from that terror, so he's a powerful force multiplier in that way, and his own impact attacks add some brutal that just gives a bunch of damage to that regiment. Now, 3 strong Sealed Temple and a Priory Commander with no special rules is a dangerous regiment, although perhaps not dangerous to meet the demands of a metagame in which huge Yoroni bricks are running around. But the other Priory Commander's warband has that. Now, it's also a Crimson Tower Priory Commander, but he is loaded to the gills. He has Caliburn, which makes the enemy re-roll all successful defense rolls against his clash and charge and technically volley attacks, which is a very powerful sword, and he has Tip of the Lance, which is a mastery that gives wedge to his regiment. He is in a 5-strong regiment of Sealed Temple, which is a very large regiment. That width, if they want to use it with fluid formation, gives them extreme threat ranges, which allows them to go a really long way and deliver a charge clash with Cleave 1, potentially the Order Supremacy for an extra attack, and Terror from the Priory Commander, and all of their impacts. This is one of the few regiments able to actually gap close and materially threaten those big Yoroni blobs, especially if they jump them before the defenses are online. You can posture this regiment a very long way from the Yoroni, like outside practical march charge distance. And if you get the first activation of the turn, go in and potentially collapse the center of strength of the enemy regiment. Against something like the Kitsune Bakasu's Origami Warriors, you're also threatening, although they do absolutely put you on notice by kind of coming pretty close to sharing your threat range. And so this gives you a list that collectively, against Yoroni, is looking to actually bring to bear the amount of force necessary to at least potentially crack the brick of the Yoroni centers of mass, while still having the MSUs in the forms of the Crimson Tower and the smaller Sealed Temple Regiment to get fairly reliable picks against Yoroni MSUs from a fairly long way away, but then also have a game plan into Sorcerer Kings. And that second thing is really important, because as much as 100 Kingdoms have kind of become acknowledged as a pretty good army at gatekeeping some of the Yoroni like out of aggressive tournament placements, right? 100 Kingdoms have become quite a good faction with a variety of different builds for equally meeting and playing against even some of the strongest Yoroni builds. Those same lists don't always play well into Sorcerer Kings, because the strengths of Sorcerer Kings are just colossally different. All of the Sorcerer Kings lists that we have seen have very high activation counts thanks to the ritual mechanic. They have consistent, very long threat ranges thanks to the Flamecasters. They exert a much larger amount of control over the course of the game than the Yoroni, at the price of being, at an individual unit-to-unit basis, much, much more fragile. And so while there are plenty of Hundred Kingdoms lists that would be good against one or the other, this list is trying to thread the needle and be good against both. Now, I definitely think of the two matchups, it is weaker against Sorcerer Kings, but it has a game plan, because it presents a wall of defense for frontage, right? All of these regiments can form line like the Rohirrim at Pelennor Fields and present a row of defense 3 models with shields that are at least theoretically capable of weathering some of the worst of the offensive output of the Flamecaster spam coming out of Sorcerer Kings. They are defensively reasonably well positioned, and then offensively they have the ability not just to match Sorcerer King's threat ranges, which they do to an extent. The 5-strong Sealed Temple Regiment with the Priory Commander has a very, very long threat range. Not to the extent of being able to out-threaten Yoroni, but being able to at least force them to feel under pressure in terms of matched threat ranges. But the more important thing this list can do, if it needs to against Sorcerer Kings, is kind of just full send. Because one of the vulnerabilities of Sorcerer Kings generally is, especially the Flamecaster-centric lists, they do not like being caught in a grapple. Those lists are very much built around combining range and threat ranges and activation control to exert control over the flow of the game at all stages, to just control all of the things your opponent might be trying to do and dictate the engagement and leverage force in a way that just kind of like de-risks all of the game, because you are controlling how all of the fights happen. And one of the ways to counter that kind of playstyle is to just full send into it and catch the entire thing in what would be called, for lack of a better term, a grapple. Engage them heavily, make a mess of the board, get lots of units in grubby fights, where the activation advantage and the nuances of the ritual mechanic and the layered buffs that Sorcerer Kings can put in place just stop mattering, because the game is now down and dirty. And this list can generate, if it wants to, that kind of a play experience, where it does things like it sends Crimson Tower across the field, march charge into combat, roll a 4+ rerollable, whoops, 75% chance, got into close combat from 18 inches away, did a bunch of damage on the charge, and now there's an annoying grapple happen. Do the same with Sealed Temple. Just like the first 4 activations of a round, the first 6 activations of a round could potentially be just a series of march charges to engage Sorcerer Kings aggressively across a broad front. And enough of those attacks, like the damage output on a march charge, even from the Priory Commander with the 5-strong unit of Sealed Temple, isn't actually one-shot territory for a Sorcerer King's MSU. It's pretty close, but it's not guaranteed. And the Crimson Tower march charges are absolutely not guaranteed to one-shot a Sorcerer King's regiment. But they can do it. It is possible with dice spikes, and if you are throwing enough things forward, you will get some of those dice spikes. And if you do that on a turn when the Sorcerer King's player, and you will know, right? You will know what rituals are in the Sorcerer King's deck. If the Sorcerer King's player hasn't prepared 2 copies of Fiery Dominion, then you are free to pull the trigger and make those charges, because they aren't going to be able to heal through it. If they have prepared those copies of Fiery Dominion, well, you can potentially play a more nuanced game, be a bit more conservative, maybe cede some space if you think you need to, continue to develop your board state, or you can make the same attacks but with the aim basically of hoping that you break the enemy regiments. To do that, you would need to have the read that your opponent hasn't positioned their rituals in a way where they can activate a regiment, rally the regiment, and then drop the rituals to heal. But the point is, you have this situation where at every given point you can pull the trigger, make very aggressive plays that transform the game state into one in which the Sorcerer Kings go from comfortable to very uncomfortable. Now, it's a very risky kind of play to do something like that. I'm not necessarily saying that in a Sorcerer Kings versus Hundred Kingdom matchup, I would expect a full send, charge of the cavalry, Hundred Kingdoms, break the back of the Sorcerer Kings and win the game. When you make a play like that, it is usually an acknowledgement of the fact that the matchup's not good, but this kind of play gives you an out. But one of the strengths of this list is that it is configured to play very well into Yoroni, but has an out into Sorcerer Kings. And as a result, while actually I'm comfortable saying, personally, this is not the kind of list that I would play, I'm not playing at Chios. This list is built quite well to meet the demands of that event, and so it kind of stands as a fascinating and stark contrast to the Sorcerer Kings lists we saw, which were very powerful mechanically, but kind of more configured for general purpose play and less configured for Chios. This is the opposite of that, although I've got no doubt that this list would perform well in casual play, like absolutely. It's not the metric by which we're judging these though. This list is configured well for Chios. Now, it does come with some limitations. The most notable of them is really just the presence of the Crimson Tower. Crimson Tower are not a bad regiment. They fit well in particular into the plan this list may choose to enact against Sorcerer Kings, but this is a list with two heavy regiments and no real guaranteed way to get them onto the field early. I've actually played against lists that are very similar to this. Kind of an amusing phenomenon that tends to repeat itself in every wargame I play is that basically like 70 to 80% of the time something significant emerges from the US. If you go back in time 6 to 8 months, you will have seen it in play in Australia. And so I have played against a quite skillfully piloted list that shares a lot of the play patterns of this list at an event. And so from personal experience, I can tell you that one of the weaknesses this list has is that it's very susceptible to having to just deal sometimes with the fact that its game plan gets shit on by really bad reinforcement rolls. It is possible for the Crimson Tower, like the list will always be fully present by round 4, but it really does not like to have to wait that long to be fully developed. If the reinforcement rolls all roll out quite well, and particularly you can equally have situations where this list is fully present by turn 3, in situations where this list is fully present by turn 3, it plays very nicely. At that point, you go into the beginning of round 4, the posturing phase of the game is over, and you have a lot of resources in place to exert threat from a large number of vectors. But if that doesn't happen, if you play against a Sorcerer Kings player and they run their list out quite well, they just have broadly lucky reinforcement rolls, and you don't, this list can be caught in a place where it has to start using that sealed temple mobility to withdraw, and if it doesn't do so quickly enough, it can find itself with this shoe caught on the other foot. Now, ultimately, any list, just about, apart from maybe like some Imperial 100 Kingdoms lists, run the risk always of, well, you got really crap reinforcement rolls, you have to manage that risk. But it is just something that's worth noting as a trap that this list can find itself caught in, particularly if it postures assuming an average reinforcement roll run out that then doesn't happen and needs to adjust quickly on the fly. Sealed Temple are very maneuverable, they can adjust their game plans, but it can be a very uphill struggle if you have to go and cede space and let your opponent entrench on scenario zones while you're waiting, figuratively and literally, for the cavalry to arrive. Now, from 100 Kingdom, we move on to Wadhrun, and our first Wadhrun player is Raymond Tan from Singapore. Now, Singapore is one of those metagames that always kind of do their own thing but are well developed about it, and as far as I can tell, they're also just a complete bunch of mad lads. And on a purely personal note, there's a very slim chance I'm actually able to meet some of them at an event in Western Australia next year if I'm able to get myself over to that. If that happens, Raymond, I really hope you're there. Now, we've started with Raymond in this case because he represents probably the most well-rounded of the Wadrun list, although there are still some interesting things present here. Raymond is running a Thunder Chieftain Warlord of the Conquest cult, and this is something that 2 of the 3 Wadrun lists will be running. He has 3 Thunder Riders, 3 Thunder Riders, and then 3 Warbred and 3 Warbred. Now, Thunder Riders don't particularly need explaining. They are a heavy regiment with flank, they are dangerous, they have long threat ranges, they are reasonably durable. They are a Wadrun centerpiece regiment and have been for as long as they have existed. Wadrun have had kind of a more troubled history, and it's interesting to see them emerge here. Now, what Wadrun do have is plenty of damage. They are cleave 2 with good clash and reasonable number of attacks and reasonable number of wounds and reasonable defense and evasion, and their penance chant gives them both Juggernaut and the ability to ignore hindering terrain. But there's never really been a position where they have emerged as an obvious or meta pick in Wadrun lists, and so it's kind of interesting to see them here. If I had to guess, and I'm doing a video about this, so I do have to guess, I would say it's probably that last bit that is giving them their relevance here. Firstly, just, good Clash and Cleave 2 matches up fairly well into Yoroni regiments that are being pushed to Defense 4 Evasion 2. It gives you something that can theoretically push some damage through there. Thunder Riders are an example of a regiment that actually does not perform tremendously well into the Yoroni blob because they are doing their damage in multiple instances, and Tenacious is maximally effective there. But the other thing, and I think probably the reason why we see Warbread here, is that if we kind of look at the rest of this list, there are 3 regiments in this list that are doing a fair bit of work with impact attacks. The Braves to an extent, but the Thunder Riders absolutely. All 3 of those are susceptible to hindering terrain. And at the last Chios event, at the last World Champions, there was a lot of hindering terrain on tables. In that environment, I actually would expect that the terrain at Chios this year will probably be very well rounded. I actually would not expect a repeat of the kind of planet forest effect that happened last year. But just as a little bit of a hedge, and as a hedge against just there is always the risk of having a table that has hindering terrain in an important location, having Warbread, which, if they have access to their chant, are not hindered by hindering terrain, just rounds out the potential of the list in a way that de-risks the possibility of the table causing you grief. Now, from there, we have a Predator. He is an Apex Master with Hide of the Silent Hunter, which means that he and the Apex Predator he will be riding will have the Opportunist special rule. This is, look, it's a 15-point ability. Fundamentally, I expect that the list had 15 points left, and so that's why it's there. But the Apex Predator that the Predator is riding is a Fiend Hunter, and there are an awful lot of regiments that you'll just be getting rerolls against anyway because of Fiend Hunter. So really my assumption is that Hide of the Silent Hunter is present because someone had 15 points spare. Otherwise there are 3 Hunting Pack, 3 Hunting Pack, and 3 Slingers in this regiment, warband. The Hunting Pack benefits significantly from the Thunder Chieftain. Shock is a very powerful ability on them, as it is on the Apex Predator. And then finally, the list is rounded out by a Matriarch Queen with 6 Braves. This is a medium-sized infantry regiment. The Matriarch Queen adds both healing and a good resolve score. She ensures them quite a lot against resolve damage, which will keep them going for a little while. They will only stand up for so long under the kind of pressure that lists in this event can generate. Things like multiple Flamecaster regiments, for example, will wear them down. But they're fundamentally not that expensive a regiment at 230 points for 6 stands, and therefore able to absorb, relatively speaking, quite a lot of punishment, which is something that you need to be able to do with this list. This is broadly the most well-rounded of the Wadhrun lists, as I mentioned. It is running 3 heavies, but 2 of those 3 have flank, which means that there is a pretty good chance that this list is fully present by turn 3 in a lot of games. That gives it lots of board presence. Every now and again there might be a Warp-Red unit that stays behind and arrives later, but overall this list is on the board quickly, pressuring quickly for a list with 3 heavies, and it's using those 3 heavies to maximize its potential damage output. Now, the Apex Predator is something that probably bears particular note, and we are going to see a lot of Apex Predators in the ensuing lists. It is just a solid piece on its own merits. 15 wounds is not hugely durable, particularly by the standards of monsters, but it's not terribly expensive. 190 points is much cheaper than basically any other monster that we will see at Chios. For example, it is less than 2/3 the cost of a Jorogumi Mahotsu. And Fiend Hunter, as we might expect from a list metagame dominated by Yoroni and Sorcerer Kings, is a really live ability. Now, despite that, it is worth keeping realistic expectations for this regiment. An Apex Predator is only 190 points, and it has only 11 attacks. If we think about the things that it's going to be fighting, the fact that it has a very good chance of landing, say, 10 of those 11 is a pretty big deal, but it gets its damage from a combination of Cleave, Terror, and Deadly Blades. You are always going to be able to use, if you're Yoroni, for example, Tenacious, to cancel out any 6s that you roll in your defense rolls, which keeps Deadly Blades limited. And between that and Native Evasion 2 on the Kami, it's basically worth noting that the Apex Predator is not a counter to the large central Yoroni blocks, but it performs very well going after Yoroni MSUs, which it is very much a threat to, and especially with the Predator is very capable of bringing down in a single activation. And because it is, firstly, a very fast regiment at March 8, and secondly, a heavy regiment, which actually means it is given the opportunity to counter deploy, I don't expect Raymond to yeet this thing into the teeth of the biggest and most threatening Yoroni regiments. At the end of the day, it's a predator piece. It wants to be going after and hunting down things that are its prey, and only when all of the targets of opportunity are dealt with would I expect it to turn its attention as part of a coordinated attack on things like the big Yoroni bricks. Now, overall, if we're just assessing how this list goes, I think it is well-rounded. I think it's cool. It has lots of good things in it. I don't know if it has kind of a singular and decisive strength. I think, if anything, the fact that it is well-rounded puts it in a position where I am not sure what the line of play is that wins it its games against any of the largest threat in the metagame. I would certainly be willing to assume that it can. I think if Raymond plays well and gets a little bit lucky and has the right run out, all of those usual preconditions for victory in a competitive event materialize that this list can pull some wins. But it's not a list where I look at it and I go, ah, this is the line of play that lets it win the game in these problem matchups. That leaves it in a position where it is skill expression and skill expression alone that is going to have to win Raymond his games. And frankly, I do respect the Singaporean meta enough to say that's 100% possible. So good luck, Raymond. This is a cool list, but it is definitely much more of a list that is prepared to take all comers. This is the kind of list that I would absolutely recommend someone at the local game store like pick up if they weren't sure where to start, than a list that is really honed to a razor's edge for the challenges of Chios. Now, our next list by Carlos from Spain, pause for the Infinity players in the audience to have a desultory chuckle at that, goes perhaps in the other direction, maybe slightly too far. Because this one is kind of a doozy. It's 10 activations, 2 warbands, 9 regiments. It is a Thunder Chieftain with Resilience, giving Hardened 1 to the Thunder Riders, and then 3 Thunder Riders, 3 Thunder Riders, 3 Blooded, a Tontor, a Winglord Predator of the Cult of War, 3 Raptor Riders, 3 Raptor Riders, and 2 Apex Predators. That is a lot of heavy regiments. That is 5 heavy regiments, and while 2 of them have flank, 3 of them don't. And that puts you in a position where you are very much at the mercy of volatility in your reinforcement dice. Now, the early game will be quite clean. The Raptor Riders will arrive in relatively short order. You will presumably auto on the Winglord Predator on turn 2 most of the time. And then on turn 3, you are going to have to just roll the dice on your heavies. The Thunder Riders will turn up. You will auto on, I would assume, the Tontor, and then you're rolling for the Apex Predators, and that puts you in a very high chance that over the course of the event, you will be waiting for the last Apex to arrive on round 5 in some games. Now, that is not necessarily the end of the world, but you need to think about the effect that that has on the other elements that are present. This is not an exclusively heavy list. There is a Winglord Predator, some Blooded, and 3 Raptor Riders, and it's the Winglord and the Raptor Riders that are the most material and mobile elements that are arriving early. Now, the Winglord is very good, and Raptor Riders are very good as well, but these aren't durable pieces. And you might recall early on during the Yoroni section, I talked about the concept of local activation superiority, right? Where during a portion of the game, even if you have maybe fewer activations overall, you might have more than your opponent, and that tends to materialize early in the game. During that part of the game where regiments are jockeying for position and light regiments are skirmishing. And all of these heavy regiments put Carlos in a position, I suspect, where he's going to have to be conservative with his aggressive light regiments and even his potentially aggressive medium regiments in many games. Basically, he's going to be forced into a kind of conservative build-up strategy because he cannot move those Raptor Riders forward into Yoroni or Sorcerer Kings or Hundred Kingdoms because they just do not represent by themselves enough mass or danger or activation count to control and threaten the game at that point. So they're basically forced into a position where they are very likely, even the Winglord is very likely to have to play passively for much of the early game while waiting for all of the force to arrive, while waiting for things like the Tauntaur to get into position, for example. And that means regiments like the Raptor Riders, for example, they're kind of wasted in comparison to being something like Hunting Pack. And so while the heavy end of Carlos's list, when it is all present, is very dangerous and with a Tontorb quite durable, I think over the course of 4 rounds, he is going to run into a position where the ambition of 5 heavy regiments catches up with him, where he has to play slowly, where he has to pull Raptor Riders back, where he has to just accept the fact that his opponent is in control of scoring and in control of the game state, and then hope that 5 heavy regiments, including 3 monsters, can pull him back into the game. And while I do think that's a possibility, there's no particular threat extension at play here, there is no activation control at play here. And while I like Apex Predators for having Fiend Hunter in this metagame quite a lot, they are not a regiment I want to expose, for example, to 5 stands of Flamecasters with extended threat range from a ritual and homing winds. Now, our final Wadhrun list is from the United Kingdom, Brandon Netherton, and this is probably our most experimental list from amongst the Wadhrun. Unlike the other 2 lists, which are running a relatively on-meta Thunder Chieftain, usually I would say that the 2 most common warlords in Wadrun are either the Thunder Chieftain or the Scion of Conquest. This list is running the viable but slightly more experimental Scion of War. Now, the Scion of War's supremacy ability is to make some tweaks to the War chant, where it gives Tenacious 1 and changes from Cleave 1 to Cleave +1 to a maximum of Cleave 2, so it doesn't really benefit the Apex Predators, for example. But it does give out Tenacious, and that's going to be a Scion of War in a really large brick of Chosen of War. Chosen of War are fairly aggressively started. They're basically kind of an equivalent to the Yoroni blob, but without the impost of bringing their defensive modifiers online, but they are a heavy regiment. These guys have 6 wounds apiece, so less wounds than the Yoroni, but they are natively defense 4, they'll have very good resolve. They get Tenacious and Terrifying and Fearless from the War Chant thanks to their own Cultist of War rule. And with 30 wounds in that regiment and a Matriarch Queen behind them capable of giving them healing, they are basically hoping to play as a regiment that can meet and match things like the Yoroni blob. Now, being a heavy is not necessarily a disadvantage here. Because they are a heavy, they will deploy after the Yoroni, and so they can posture to meet whatever regiment it is that they want to challenge in the Yoroni line. Now, the downside of being heavy is that they don't start arriving until turn 3. They don't have any particular speed advantage, which means that it can take usually until about turn 4 or 5, and quite often it will be turn 5, for them to push toward a decisive clash, and then it will be subsequent turns before they can push into an objective zone. They're also, while they are a very good regiment, 30 wounds is still fewer wounds than the Yoroni. Tenacious 2 is a really good ability, and so they're really banking on the fact that they have a much higher offensive output than their Yoroni counterparts to win a fight. They aren't so dangerous that they will win that fight in a single turn. We're talking multiple turns of grinding, in which the Yoroni can bring other regiments up. It is a more even fight, I think, than perhaps the Scion of War would like it to be, but it is still a surprisingly manageable engagement if Brandon can keep the fight as a one-on-one and then push through. In terms of the rest of the list, we have a Matriarch Queen. She has the History upgrade. For those unfamiliar with it, the History upgrade reads, if your army would be a 1,995 point list, make it a 2,000 point list instead. Now, she's going to be sitting in a unit of 3 Braves. She's mostly going to be, I suspect, dedicated to support of the Chosen of War. Her To the Last Breath draw event heals non-monster regiments. The best current list in Wadrun for healing with To the Last Breath are Defense 4 Tenacious Chosen of War. So she is there just to support them, I suspect, most of the time, and help give them the edge in the Yoroni matchup, get through that fight, restore stands if need be, continue going on to fight other battles, and not get worn down by Yoroni attrition and the fact that Yoroni have healing of their own. We've then got 2 Apex Predators, then a Predator of War, 3 Hunters, 3 Raptor Riders, 3 Slingers, and a Quaddle. Now, the list all being War makes a lot of sense in terms of maximizing the effect of the Scion of War himself. This is another list with lots of heavy regiments. Now, there are no flank regiments in this list, which means that it's going to be in a pretty similar position to Carlos from Spain, where there's a very reasonable chance it's going to be waiting for Apex Predators to turn up, potentially as late as turn 5. I'm not 100% on this, but I think that's probably a little bit less of a risk for this list, though. And the reason why I kind of think that is that the run out for this list seems much clearer to me. It is going to bring on its light and skirmishing regiments, hunters, raptor riders, and slingers. The difference between those and Carlos's list is that the hunters and slingers, including with the predator, firstly, that's a lot of activations on the board early. That's 4 activations that are locked up in your light regiments, 4 activations you can have on the board as early as turn 1. And while there are raptor riders present there, poke with the slingers and poke with the hunters is a very easy plan to fall back on and just be like, I'm just going to exert some pressure. I'm going to just sort of occupy a space that contests one of these zones. I am going to be present as an element to shape the board with enough activations, but more importantly, range to enable these regiments to get value without having to extend in the way that just a duo Raptor Riders would. There are then 3 medium regiments, and one of the really important things here is that I suspect the Matriarch Queen is actually just not coming on. She's happy not being one of the regiments that arrives on turn 2. That'll probably usually be the Quaddle, it doesn't have to. The point is that the skirmish line just continues to skirmish at this point, and then a decisive arrival is made on turn 3. It's at that point that you want the Chosen of War and the Matriarch, and much of the time one Apex Predator, arriving and beginning to move in a position that can decisively shift the battlefield. Efforts before then do not have to be committal because the commitment of the Chosen of War promises to be decisive. The line of play is really clear, whereas the line of play with Carlos's list, while it's bringing on a very similar amount of force, in fact, in many respects, it's bringing on more force. 2 regiments of Thunder Riders and a Tauntaur are guaranteed, and then often it will roll successfully, bring on an Apex Predator. The difference is that those Chosen of War feel very deliberate in terms of many of the matchups this list is going to engage into. Carlos is playing a bit more of a game of, I hope these heavies in a general sense are good. Brandon, at least to me and my appraisal, feels like he has a very specific plan for kind of the 2 main boogeymen of the metagame. For Yoroni, he has a list that can muscle through even their most muscular regiments. And for Sorcerer Kings, he has a Defense 4 Tenacious regiment with healing that can, at least theoretically, and for a time, endure the attention of their most powerful ranged regiments. Now, I don't think this is a list that is a guarantee to win into any of those. We've spent a lot of time talking about just how mechanically powerful Yoroni and Sorcerer Kings and lists that are engineering themselves to engage into those lists are. But I do think this is a list with a plan. I think it's an ambitious plan. I think this is probably the most experimental of the Wadhrun lists that we have seen. But it's a list with a goal in mind, and that immediately gets you a chunk of the way toward how you're going to win games at an event as competitive as Chios. Now, 3 factions to go. We're on into Dwegom, and there is just one Dwegom player at Chios. That is Brian from the USA. And Brian is running a really, really cool Tempered Creed list. Now, Tempered Creed has kind of been left by the wayside a little bit for a while now, at least in the United States, and to an extent in Australia as well. Mostly just as kind of a dated list, even though the core mechanic of the tempered tokens, the elemental potency tokens and how they're used, is still really quite powerful. I am really happy to see it in play again at Chios, and I think it's in play in large part because of the release of the Lost Ancestor and the Lost. Now, if you want to read a bunch of thoughts about this, they're actually present in the Goonhammer article that I showed off at the beginning of this video. But the short version, short, is that the Lost Ancestor and Lost are both very efficient regiments and key really nicely into really any of the possible list archetypes that exist for Dwegom right now, but in particular they key into Tempered, because the Lost Ancestor is a spellcaster, and because he's a spellcaster he generates tokens, and the Lost themselves are really good beneficiaries of Tempered tokens. Their defenses sit at that halfway point of high wound count and like okay enough defense and resolve, and it's in that kind of environment where the saves that you are auto passing with Tempered Creed tokens actually like really you had a chance of failing them that was significant. It's not like auto passing plink damage on Steelforged. It is, oh, this is a cleave to attack reducing my defense to 1. I'll just auto pass that, thank you very much. That's genuinely really powerful. On top of that, this is a Tempered Steel Shaper list. Now, Tempered Steel Shapers as the Warlord, it's kind of for a very long time now, there has been, at the sort of top levels of play, Kind of an understanding that the best tempered warlord was probably the Steel Shaper, because the effect of his supremacy was very strong, but there was never quite a list that completely put it together in a way that was satisfying. And that's because, by comparison, having a tempered sorcerer warlord just gave you consistent value every round in a way that was measurable. Two spells. That's really good. Spells generate tokens. Spells are powerful. It was always clear and obvious what was strong about a tempered sorcerer warlord, whereas a tempered steel shaper warlord still needed to answer the questions of how it would generate all of the tokens that it needed before it could get to the point of spending those tokens to not just auto pass rolls, but heal when they were doing so. And in this list, we have the answer to that question with the highest character count of any list at the event, with 4 characters, all of whom are spellcasters and therefore can generate tokens. So Tempered Steel Shaper Warlord, 3 Hold Ballistae, 3 Fireforged, 3 Fireforged, and 3 Steelforged. I think depending on the matchup in this list, the Steel Shaper has a very reasonable chance of joining either Ballistae or Fireforged. The default choice is probably Ballistae. They are a light regiment, and that means they get him on the field early, and that means that he's casting spells early. And because of how precious tokens are in this list, because the tokens in this list are so high value, that means much of the time the Tempered makes sense to be placed in the Hold Ballistae. But he's also really, really valuable. There are theoretically some situations where if you expect it to be under enough pressure, or facing down sufficient threat, for example, playing against Sorcerer Kings, you might just slap him in the Fireforged because the Fireforged will last just that little bit longer against 1 billion fireballs coming your way from many, many Flamecaster regiments. Now, the next warband is an Ardent Kerouac with Flaming Oratory. He has 2 regiments of 3 Flame Berserkers. Now, he does a few things that are important. The main one is that he is a spellcaster arriving on the board in a light regiment, which means that he is generating tokens from very early in the game. He can't personally spend those tokens, but he does spin them up so that the tempered characters and the aura around them can spend them. The other thing he does is he gives this regiment light scoring. He does need to succeed at a spell to do that, but there are multiple light regiments in this list. All of them are capable of getting onto zones in the game on turn 2 and then being given scoring weight by the Ardent Kerouac. Because this list does not run out hugely quickly, there are quite a few speed 5. There are many speed 6, but there are also quite a few speed 5 regiments in this list, mostly the range ones, to be fair. This list doesn't run out tremendously quickly. It's aggressive enough onto the board. It has no heavies, it has many lights, but it isn't running things like Raptor Riders or a million goals with Vanguard. The ability to just get onto a zone and hold a zone with a convincing amount of force and scoring points gives the list a small but meaningful advantage, particularly against things like Sorcerer Kings. The fact that this list has 2 regiments of Hold Ballistae and 2 regiments of Flame Berserkers with characters in them gives it, I think, of all of the lists at the event, the best early game localized activation control. Coupled with light scoring, that puts it in a position where it isn't likely to accrue a decisive scenario advantage early, but it can put itself in a position where it's just a little bit ahead, and at that point, the clock starts to favor it. And that's particularly valuable because this list wants time to position, get itself in place, and to spin up tokens to carry it into a late game advantage as well. Coupling early game advantage with late game advantage through different paths is one of the best things that you can do in Conquest, and there's just this little tweak of the Ardent Kerouac and these light Ballistae regiments supporting the Flame Berserkers that puts you in a position to take a small early advantage. Don't overextend. Like, you wouldn't want to feed those regiments into the teeth of multiple arriving Yoroni or Sorcerer Kings high quality regiments like on turn 3, but just to take and hold ground and build that position of small advantage that can really make a difference in matchups into powerful opposing factions. We then have a Lost Ancestor with 2 regiments of Lost. No regiments are found, that's not hugely surprising. I have played into Found several times now. I actually really like them. They're a fun, clean regiment to play. They don't have a place in a list like this. This list is needing to be very efficient with many pieces. Lost are very efficient. They key into this list very well, and the Lost Ancestor himself keys into this list very well by being just a powerful offensive and support caster, generating those tokens, adding all of his punch to that regiment. We've then got, and this is a cool little bit of secret sauce, a Tempered Sorcerer of Earth in 3 Hold Ballistae. Now, there are 3 schools of spell that you could pick for Tempered Sorcerer: Fire, Earth, and Magma. Earth is by far the least chosen. Magma is the most common because it bridges the gap between being able to consistently generate tokens and damage. Fire is the next most common because it is very, very dangerous. It has the downside in a Tempered Creed list of to generate tokens, there have to be enemies in range. You can, against a Fire Sorcerer based list, starve them of tokens by holding back out of range until you're ready to commit. Earth Sorcerer is mostly strictly defensive. All three of his spells read as defensive buffs or offensive debuffs. There's no damage there, but all of them are kind of cool and interesting. I would just have described them as niche, except for the fact that this list's light run-out regiments benefit really kind of well from them. So it's worth actually just breaking this down and talking about it because it's one of the things that makes this list really interesting. Because the sorcerer can be, firstly, just consistent generating tokens. If nothing else, he can be casting rock shaping every round on any regiment. Usually it'll be one of the MSUs. It will be like the MSU of Flame Berserkers without the Ardent in them, because then it is easiest to cast. That's a scaling spell. And it gives Tenacious well and good. The main thing it does is it generates a token. Tokens are very valuable in this list. Broken Ground is a target, range 14, target enemy regiment can't perform impact attacks on its next charge. That is extremely niche, but we did just finish going through an awful lot of Thunder Rider regiments. It's not impossible that it may see some play at some point over the course of the event, although I think it is the least likely spell for him to cast. The really interesting one is Roots of Stone. Roots of Stone is 10-inch range, can target friendly or enemy regiments, and gives that regiment, has to target a regiment that hasn't yet activated, and gives that regiment +2 defense, but prevents them from performing march, charges, reforms, combat reforms, or withdraws. That is a very powerful buff and a very powerful debuff, and it offers some really interesting options because, like, one of the things that this list has to be able to do is stuff like weather the offense of powerful high volume of attack units. Well, at least hypothetically, once you have a unit of Flame Berserkers on a zone, you can have the Ardent Kerouac give them scoring, the Tempered Sorcerer in the subsequent round give them +2 defense, and the Tempered Steel Shaper give them hardened. At that point, you have a defense 5, hardened 1, tenacious 1 regiment. Wow, that's actually insanely durable. There is no regiment in this entire event that can one-tap that. Huh. That's really interesting. Is it a niche play? Yes, because it locks a unit in place. But we look at the early potential that this list has, and it's working really interestingly and really consistently. Just operating on the assumption that the Tempered Steel Shaper will be in the hold ballistae, on turn 1, you can have as many as 7 activations on the board. 3 of those are spellcasters who can buff the regiments that they're in, or debuff enemies that are opposing them. The debuffs and buffs all stack and can be complementary. The maximum amount of like penalty you can inflict on an opponent, for example, if you need to tear down a Yoroni death blob, you can give them collectively -1 resolve, -1 defense, and let your entire army reroll hit rolls against them. Now, that last one is tricky because that's a Lost Ancestor spell. It has a range of only 10 inches, but more importantly, he's Priest 6 and it's scaling and it's Attunement 3 and there'll be a Mahotsu nearby. So that one is optimistic to cast, but nevertheless, the theory does exist. Like, you can stack a huge amount of buffs and debuffs, and this list makes really good use of those things. Lost inflict a large number of hits. Flame Berserkers inflict a large number of hits. They are good vehicles for buffs, and they're particularly good vehicles for layered buffs. And so there are just all of these things that are going on here. All of these little mechanical edges that combine with a very cohesive plan. The list is on the board aggressively early. It has localized activation control over, I think, every other list at the event. It can use that control to good effect in the early game to seize territory and scenario points while it is building up a stockpile of tokens that it can use to carry it through to decisive advantage in the late game. It is trading on the efficiency of combat regiments like the Steelforged and the Lost, and the multiplicative capacity of units like the Flame Berserkers when they are buffed by other spells. That is just a bunch of really cool, cohesive, combined plans that make me really excited for this list. I think it's really, really cool. Now, it is not without limitations. Probably the biggest thing about this list that is really worth noting is that it spends an awful lot of points on characters, basically more than any other list, I think, and especially it is spending points on characters that are then being placed in minimum sized units. Flame Berserkers with a bunch of buffs on them can be made quite durable, but as a baseline, they are defense 3. good resolve, but only 5 wounds. Lost are also quite durable, but again, as a baseline, they are defense 3. And if one of those 5 strong regiments of Flamecasters of Matthias's just lands 50 hits on you because it rolled marginally above average, the fact that you can spend tokens to get a pseudo-tenacious effect is not going to save the regiment. And so there is an awful lot of play that has to be made. Like, this list has to be piloted very carefully. But there are just a ton of vehicles for micro decisions and ideas and concepts in play, different tools that can be leveraged in the right place and time that can influence the outcome of a game in a bunch of cumulative ways. And I get really excited for lists like that. Brian, this is probably my favorite list of the event. It's super cool, and I wish you a ton of luck. From here, second last faction. Oh, this has been going for a while, into Nords with our Canada representative, Mass of Bonk Table. I am almost certain that anyone who watches this video will be at least passingly familiar with his stuff, but if not, there's a YouTube channel. It's called Bonk Table, it covers Conquest, and it has a ton of content. Now, Nords generally going into Chios are in the reasonable position of it's a good faction. It's a good faction. It is sitting basically right at the balance point that I suspect the developers broadly are aiming for in the game. Very, very close to something like 100 Kingdoms, multiple viable list archetypes, lots of different viable units, maybe a little bit congested in terms of they only have a few warlord choices. In fact, it's basically they have one warlord supremacy choice that's across 2 different warlords. But with the sole exception of the fact that it's basically only ever the Volva and sometimes the Shaman that you see as the warlord, there is a lot going on in Nords that can let the faction shift in different directions. Where they can run into a little bit of an issue is that they are less customizable than 100 Kingdoms. Nords have more of a baked-in game plan, where kind of regardless of what you're doing, many Nords lists will have approximately the same kind of plan that they want to pursue. They have regiments that are not hugely durable, but are dangerous. They do a lot of damage before they die. They trade effectively. They fight and scrap and raid. And that produces a faction with a lot of different options to play a pleasingly cohesive playstyle, but they do need to try and find ways to push away from that playstyle or customize that playstyle when there are weird demands from the metagame. And that's kind of the situation that we are in here. So from left to right, we have a blooded, good combat character who gives his regiment flank thanks to forward force. That's just really nice. He has Taijokul the Reinhardt, which gives Tenacious 1 up to a maximum of Tenacious 2. He will be playing in those 3 trolls. They have a really high regeneration score, a good wound count, and defend based on their evasion. Their evasion will be 2 thanks to the Shaman Warlord. Now, it's just an MSU of trolls, but because the Blooded can entourage activate, he can have if they break, for example, the Blooded can activate Rally the Regiment, chain into the trolls can regenerate, their regeneration is massive, restore an entire stand, go on and have a punch on. We then have 3 Stalkers, 3 Golter Beast Pack, and 3 Golter Beast Pack. Dangerous, Linebreaker, Impact Regiment, Trample to back it up, and notably, Golter are cavalry, not brutes. That makes a little bit of difference, actually, with all of the Fiend Hunter going around in response to Yoroni. Now, Golter are an example of one of those regiments, I think, that fits into this is a very Nord regiment, and it's a very good regiment, but needs to be applied kind of carefully in the Chios metagame, because Golter try and do their damage across multiple different kinds of attacks. They have good impact attacks, they have good clash attacks, and they have trample. That collectively is really, really good. It does not work trying to punch into Tenacious 2 regiments. And so, for example, in the Yoroni matchup, Golter need to be deployed doing things like chasing down enemy MSUs, not dealing with the center mass regiment. Anyway, we then have a second Blooded with Ryoda, the Redbringer. That gives impact attacks to the regiment. Again, the Blooded will almost certainly be in Trolls. There is some old tech of having a Blooded in Stalkers for very, very early objective destruction, because you can have a volley and then tramples. Impacts, rather, realistically, I expect the Blooded to be in Trolls. Ryoda, the Redbringer, also gets +2 attacks and also means the Blooded can always go down fighting. It is an expensive sword, but it does definitely tune the Blooded's offense up quite a long way. And as noted, since he'll be in Trolls, you can have him rally the regiment, them activate, them regenerate. As long as they don't get one-shot, which is a risk that they can run, they are not infinitely durable. But as long as they don't get one-shot, They can usually punch on for maybe a couple of rounds and earn some value. 3 more Stalkers. Now, just to note, Stalkers, I think, are another one of those regiments that, look, not hugely well suited to the Chios metagame. They are, in general terms, a really nicely rounded regiment. They are a light ranged regiment with a good count of shots and opportunist for only 130 points. That, on its merits, in a vacuum, is excellent. What is not clear is how they fit, ideally, into any of the matchups this list is playing into. I don't really want to see them into 100 Kingdoms. They will bounce off of the high defense. I don't know how they deal with Yoroni tenacious regiments, and this list has got ample other things that can be used to engage and destroy Yoroni MSUs. Ultimately, they're 130 points. I don't need to ask terribly much of them, but I will be curious to see how much value Mass gets out of those. Otherwise, rounding out the Second Blooded Warband, we have 3 Fenrir and 3 more Golter. Then we have a Shaman with Figurehead of the Naglfar. He's going to be in 3 Raiders with a Captain, and the Figurehead basically says, "Oh god, please don't let me die to one shot from a Flamecaster volley." It gives Tenacious 3 against range attacks, which is really just desperately hoping that if those Raiders get jumped by a downtown Flamecaster Death Ball, they can survive. And you really want them to survive because it's a light scoring regiment and the Shaman offers some value. Now, the main reason why there is a Shaman here, the more common pick would usually be the Volya. The Volya is slightly better value, she's got slightly better spells, she is slightly more expensive, but the Shaman offers the same supremacy, and there's a couple of things that are worth noting here. Firstly, there are just not that many infantry regiments that are important to heal. Yes, the Stalkers technically could be healed, but the Trolls are going to heal themselves, and the Volya couldn't heal any of the Golter or the Fenrir. Secondly, the Shaman's warband includes a Sea Jotnar, and the Sea Jotnar is a big, powerful, heavy giant with Fiend Hunter. Fiend Hunter is well suited to fighting monsters and brutes, and there are a lot of monsters and brutes at the top end of the regiment, top end of the meta. Now, a little bit like the Golter actually, it should be noted that the Sea Jotnar is not a piece that you want to just fling into the teeth of the most powerful Yoroni regiments. He is not invulnerable. Particularly relative to his points cost, he's actually kind of a fragile monster. Defense 3, Resolve 3 with only 16 wounds can absolutely go down very quickly, but his offensive output is really good. He has impacts and a free barrage and a very good clash stat with clash 3, 13 attacks, cleave 2, and terror 1. And especially with the free volley, he's able to put damage in useful paces, finish off regiments. He's very reliable at doing things like finishing off badly wounded brute regiments, just as part of his general activation. What he doesn't want to do is to go into a Yoroni Center of Mass regiment because he's doing his damage across multiple instances. He has impacts and then a clash and then a volley. Just like with the Golter, that is exactly the wrong kind of attack setup to deal with a Tenacious 2 regiment. With that limitation in mind, though, a Fiend Hunter monster is well suited into the current metagame if it is applied correctly. Now, ultimately, I think this list has some solid strengths and some solid limitations, and is mostly a fairly good attempt to take generic good stuff Nords and steer it, not massively, but just steer it lightly into the headwinds of the current metagame. Trolls are good. Blooded are good. Golter are good. A unit of Fenrir is pretty solid. It's another flank regiment. This list has got lots of flank. Having 3 medium flank regiments gives you just a hugely consistent aggressive runout and lets you get very heavily on the board. Usually this list will be fully present by turn 3. The list has got early scoring, and while its light presence is not tremendously strong, 3 Raiders, the Shaman, and the 2 units of Stalkers is usually probably enough to dissuade anything this side of, say, a Yoroni Origami unit from committing into you for the kill, letting the list score maybe a few early points while then everything else runs out on turn 2. It's solid, it's consistent. What's not completely clear is if that solid and consistent nature is being customized enough toward the headwinds of Yoroni and Sorcerer Kings. You've got a very good regiment count. Most of your regiments are dangerous. You have some good threat ranges to leverage, and just a little bit of tech against some of the meta boogeymen. But I do wonder how this list will go into the teeth of any of the Yoroni lists, and even some of the skewier, more first order optimal kind of Fire Court Sorcerer Kings list. Now, our second Nords list is from Germany, Tim Lucas Steinbruggen, and it shares some similarities with Mass's list, although going in some other directions in other ways. This list has a Volya Warlord, which means just like the Shaman Warlord in Massa's list, it's giving +1 evasion to a maximum of 2 to the regiments in the army. In this case, the Volya is in a very interesting setup, where she has Taijokul, that's Tenacious +1 to a maximum of 2. She's a unit of 5 raiders with a captain. They have Tenacious 1 natively, which means that with her they will go up to Tenacious 2. Tenacious 2 is really good, and between that, Evasion 2, and Healing, that's actually kind of a cool early game brick. We then have a Vargo Lord with Massive Frame, that gives him extra impact attacks and Linebreaker. He will probably be in the 3 Werewolves, although he could also join other regiments. I think he's allowed to join the Golter. 2 units of Fenrir Beast Pack and 1 unit of Golter Beast Pack. And then a Konungur, 3 Bow Chosen, 3 Bow Chosen, 3 Steel Chosen, and there it is again, the Sea Jotnar. So a similar train of thought, right? The Sea Jotnar has Fiend Hunter, Fiend Hunter is very well positioned in the current metagame. We are just taking the ship of Nords that tends to sail in a singular, solid direction, steering it very slightly to counteract some of the threat posed by the prevailing metagame. Now, there are a bunch of cool things going on here. I am ultimately going to have to put myself in the camp of I am not sure how well this will perform. That's not in the sense of an indictment of this list. This actually is a little bit outside my experience, and I genuinely don't have a good mental model for how I think this list will go. The 5 Raiders is particularly interesting. I would describe it as experimental. It's very possible that Tim Lucas has played it many times and has a good idea of how durable it is. One of the things I feel like I would be concerned about is that it's actually kind of at serious risk of being subject to duels. The Volya is not a bad fighter, but she is not going to stand up to something like a Kitsune Makasu or a Daimyo, or a Daiokai, or a Mahotsu, or even like a Priory Commander, for example. And if those raiders find themselves in a position where their leader has declined a duel before they activate and before they get hit, that can have really negative effects on that regiment. It significantly reduces your resolve, it significantly reduces your damage output. It's just kind of a risk that I would expect to potentially materialize a lot given the lists that are being played at Hios. And once you have spent that much on a regiment like that, you can't really afford to be passive with a 6 strong, heavily force multiplied infantry unit. The other thing I'm struggling to have a read on is the Bow Chosen in the Konunger's Warband. Now, with Massa's regiment, I could look at it and say, I am not convinced that those stalkers are going to be particularly high value, but they're not expensive, so it doesn't particularly matter. Bow Chosen are much more expensive. They are 190 to the 160 points you will see on stalkers. And while they are absolutely much more dangerous and I believe more durable, it's not entirely certain that this is a metagame where that damage will pay off relative to the significant additional points. Like they are almost 50% more expensive than Stalkers. They are not a regiment that can afford to do nothing. And if they end up staring down something like a unit of Origami Warriors or Damaru Damashi, they are just risking not doing nearly enough damage proportionate to their points to make themselves worthwhile. There are matchups where the Botosen could be really, really good. Into 100 Kingdoms, Precise Shot with Opportunist, that's absolutely strong. Into the Dwegom, for example, they can potentially have a fair bit of payoff as well. But when we think about the 3 most common factions that are present here, Yoroni, Sorcerer Kings, and Wadhrun, collectively comprising 2/3 of the field, you are looking at a lot of evasion, a lot of tenacious versus shooting, or in the case of Sorcerer Kings, just a counter battery game that Bow Chosen cannot match. And so while I think Bow Chosen generally and Bow Chosen Opportunist specifically are a really cool regiment, I'm not convinced that they aren't a maladaption in this particular case. Now, that notwithstanding, overall this list has cool things going on. A little bit like Mass's list, this list is fundamentally trying to do Nord things, and Nord things are cool. But again, a little bit like Mass's list, this is actually a list that I would almost say is going to be at its best not at Hios, but like 2 or 3 weeks after, when the boogeymen at Hios have been nerfed by the next balance update. Now, last but not least, as we close in on 2 hours on this video, we have Old Dominion from, I believe, our 3rd Polish player, Arcadius, and this is a Hiliarch Warlord regiment. Now, in the Goonhammer article linked at the beginning of this video, I speculated that we might see a Theocrator at Hios, but that it wasn't a certainty. This has kind of showed it wasn't a certainty. And as much as the Theocrator is powerful and has some interesting Dark Horse potential, I really cannot blame Arcadius for not taking one. Unlike, say, the Lost for Dwegom, where they were very clearly what they like, it was clear what the Lost use case is, they fit well into an existing archetype, and the rules for them had existed for long enough to actually get an idea of how they would perform well in advance of Hios list submission. The somewhat chaotic rules release of the Theocrator, the more recent rules release of the Theocrator, and then look, if nothing else, the fact that getting a handle on that regiment, like actually physically buying it, getting it into your possession, assembling and painting it before Hios, given its release date, I think in retrospect it was probably optimistic of me to say that we might see one. This is a much more reasonable example of the kind of list that we probably, in retrospect, should have expected to see at Hios, and it is a Heliarch Warlord list. The Heliarch has Calamitous Blade of the Kelsor, which gives him 7 attacks, Cleave 2, and Flurry. So a very powerful combat character. And then Legio Primigenia, a banner that lets the regiment that he joins count the dark power as 1 tier higher. In his warband, he has 3 Legionnaires, just a mainstay, cool, they score, whatever. 5 Praetorian Guard with a Profane Reliquary, 5 Varangian Guard with a Standard Bearer, all of these have Standard Bearers, and then 5 Athanatoi. Now, for my money, I assume he's going to be going in the Praetorian Guard. I actually could well be wrong about that. Any of those 3 primary combat regiments you might find the Heliarch in. And that's because the question that we're actually looking at here really is the question of, once again, force economy. Depending on what this list thinks it needs to kill, and whether the thing this list thinks needs to kill is an enormously durable Yoroni regiment, there is some argument for moving the Heliarch around into different parts of those lists. But as a default, my assumption would be that he goes in the Praetorian Guard. They benefit the most from Legio Primigenia. It gets them to a point where they can always, as a draw event, activate their Bastion, which is very significant, and actually quite early in the game, activate Bastion both as a draw event and an action, which lets them get to Defense 5. Defense 5 is very good, for example, against Sorcerer Kings. You can form a wide line and hold off really a lot of offense from things like Flamecasters, particularly the Sorcerer Kings list that are going very, very, very heavily on Flamecasters with less of a focus on melee aspects. You can potentially hold off a lot of those with something like a Defense 5 Praetorian Guard unit, so assumption is that the Heliarch is in this unit. Now, his supremacy benefits just his warband, and it is simple and straightforward. It allows a free additional clash, which means that in an ideal world, you're able to charge Clash Clash for massive damage, but quite often you'll be using this for threat extension. What that means is that you'll be using this to be able to declare a march, then a charge, then a clash, which allows even a March 5 regiment like the Praetorian Guard or Varangians a fairly long threat range. In a really ideal world, you might see a situation where you're able to jockey with and then close with, say, a Yoroni list, and then really hammer them with a double clash from something, but much of the time, unless Arcadius is really in control of the flow of the game, and he will have an activation advantage over all of the Yoroni lists, I would assume he'll mostly use the supremacy for threat extension. And against Sorcerer Kings, I would especially expect that, but that's very reasonable in that case. Sorcerer Kings do not like it when you can jump them from downtown with multiple regiments. We then have a Hero Deacon, 3 Cultists, that's what the Hero Deacon will almost certainly join, get onto the board early and start generating dark power. 3 Legionnaires with an Optio, that gives the regiment Vanguard, which lets it get aggressively onto zones if it needs to, and then 2 units of 3 Caryatids. These are the ranged statues, and we'll kind of come back to them as how well they fit into the list. Finally, we have an Archimandrite with 3 Legionnaires. This is a list that can reach Dark Power Tier 4. That gives the Archimandrite just a ton of healing juice in the late game. Any of those 3 primary combat regiments, the Praetorian, the Varangian, or the Athanatoi, all of them benefit from being healed by the Archimandrite. Healing in Old Dominion is a little bit of a nightmare to deal with because they're so durable, they don't take resolve damage. That healing is proportionally more effective because it's so much more difficult to deal each individual wound to the Old Dominion. The Archimandrite also keys very nicely into the Hero Deacon. In an ideal world, he will arrive on turn 2. The Hero Deacon will be able to start sacrificing Legionnaires out of the Archimandrite's warband, or regiment, which the Archimandrite will then very casually heal back. Now, one of the things that this list has sort of garnered a little bit of attention for already, in terms of discussion on the Discord, for example, is those 2 regiments of Caryatids. And the critique, kind of reasonably, is that they are not a perfect fit for the defenses they will be firing into in this metagame. When we think about the potentially high evasion, high tenacious of all of the Yoroni regiments, we think about the healing that can be done by Sorcerer Kings, chip damage from 2 regiments of Volley 2 Caryatids, has to get very lucky to, for example, break a unit of Sorcerer King's Brutes and prevent them from being healed. And those are not unreasonable points to make about the Caryatids in a vacuum. I think why the Caryatids are in here is actually just how well they fit into the reinforcement curve of the army. This list has a lot of medium regiments that it wants to arrive early in the game. It wants those Praetorians and ideally the Athanatoi. The Athanatoi could feasibly wait, but it wants those Praetorians on the board early, and it wants the Legionnaires that the Archimandrite are in on the board early. Assuming we are aiming to get Praetorian Guard, Athanatoi, and Legionnaires all onto the board on turn 2, that's going to require a bunch of medium reinforcement dice, which the Caryatids help provide. On top of that, and just to note, there are 7 medium regiments in this list. After you auto on 1, you roll for 6. That means mathematically you're most likely to have 2 successes, i.e. exactly enough to get the Athanatoi and Legionnaires present. Anyway, on top of that, once you have met that thing, once you've gotten the Praetorian, Athanatoi, and Legionnaires present, you're then in a situation where next round you have a bunch of forward-positioned size 1 infantry, and if in that circumstance you are under pressure by an aggressive enemy, not necessarily Yoroni, but like anyone is posturing to pressure you, an ideal regiment subsequently to turn up is the Caryatids, who walk on very naturally behind the Praetorian Guard, behind the Athanatoi, and are able to start making volley attacks over their heads. Now, are those volley attacks likely to be high value? Initially, no. Unless something very weird is happening, those Caryatids put out an average of 3 1/3 hits at range on the turn that they arrive, which against many Yoroni regiments does an average of literally 0 damage. But that's kind of not the point. The point is that they occupy a position very naturally in a broader formation where they can subsequently generate a lot of value. After all of those dangerous melee regiments push forward, you are in a position where you still need things to occupy zones. Caryatids are very good at that. You will often be in a position where you don't need a lot of damage to complete a unit kill or break a regiment. Caryatids, particularly ones that are aiming, are very good at that. And if you are being pressured aggressively, noting that there is possibly a little bit of risk being assumed by someone who is aggressively pressuring a Heliarch list before it has used its supremacy ability, they are very good at point-blank firing at effective range into regiments doing things like heavily engaging the Praetorian Guard or the Athanati, which helps just keep you safe until you are in position to use your supremacy. And buying that space is worthwhile, right? This list does not want to be forced into a situation where it uses its supremacy before the Varangian Guard are in place. It wants to just let the game breathe a little bit before it pulls the trigger on things, for multiple reasons. It wants the Varangians in position, in line and able to launch similar attacks to the Praetorians and the Athanatoi. It also wants to just generate dark power. This is an Old Dominion list. It has the effective dark power engine, where the Hero Deacon and Archimandrite, if left to their own devices, tick up the dark power by 2 every turn, plus the 1 you get for free. It is also a list that can reach Dark Power Tier 4 because of the Heliarch, which means that if just nothing happens and the game just breathes for multiple turns, Old Dominion progress in power, not massively, but the list gets more powerful as time passes. And so having Caryatids as a regiment that, yes, they are not hugely well adapted for long-range unaimed shots into Yoroni defenses, but even Yoroni have to respect the damage that they can do if they are able to aim with Memories of Old in effective range. They help the game breathe a little. They just make things maybe not close and resolve quickly, and that is ideal for Old Dominion. Kind of more than anything, what this list actually reminds me of, and the phrase that came to mind, is looking at the Yoroni dominated metagame, looking at how durable they are, looking at the complaints that people are making, even like very, very good players are making about how tough Yoroni are. I see this list and I just think of the line, "Do not cite the deep magic to me, which I was there when it was written." And I have been an Old Dominion player. I have played the faction that everyone complained about the durability of for like years. And this list is that kind of old magic. It's tough. It is an old Dominion list. It can get very high defenses. It can heal, and it can heal effectively. And healing against Old Dominion is nightmarish to deal with. It has long threat ranges. It is dangerous. It does actually many of the things that people think that Yoroni are good because of. And it's just kind of cool to see that in play as a result. Now, I do think this list has limitations, and I think genuinely the biggest issue that this list faces is probably not the Yoroni matchup. It will take time for this list to get through Yoroni, but it has the tools necessary to do so. I think the bigger threat this list faces is still fundamentally the Sorcerer Kings. As much as I spent time, frankly, lambasting some of those Sorcerer Kings lists for being over-focused on aggressive use of Flamecasters to a point where they were maybe not actually fully optimized for the Chios meta, this is a list that does not like to stare down 5 regiments of Flamecasters. Ranged attacks have always been proportionally effective against Old Dominion because ranged attacks are balanced around not taking resolve rolls, which in effect takes the Old Dominion ability to not take resolve rolls and just kind of makes it a non-issue. And even if there is maybe some limited inefficiency in those first 2 Sorcerer Kings lists, it is ultimately a limited inefficiency. It is more than made up for by the fact that they just key into this matchup really effectively. They can heal through poke damage from the Caryatids, and that Athanati regiment, for example, just does not want to deal with 3 Flamecasters all teeing off on it in the same turn. I do suspect that Arcadius has some practice into that matchup. I would certainly, in his shoes, be practicing into Fire Court, Sorcerer Kings, and Meta Yoroni. But to win those games, he's going to need to play clean, he's going to need to play fast, he's going to need to play focused. The advantage sits with Sorcerer Kings at a mechanical level, and so if he's not on point about getting his entire game plan in action, making sure everything rolls out the way that he wants to, and even just playing a full 10 rounds, which is something that I would always expect any player at Hios to be able to do, but especially as an Old Dominion player is absolutely necessary to practice, is just a point of concern with regards to the list. Still, it's the only Old Dominion player present, very much hoping that Arcadius represents the faction well, because it's a cool faction. And so, just as with everyone else, I wish him the best of luck. And that, after 2 hours, wraps this video up. I hope very much that you enjoyed this, and if you did, and you'd like to support the channel, by all means go ahead, click like, subscribe, and if you'd like to support the channel directly, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. I primarily cover games like Infinity, but Conquest is my main secondary game, and holds a very special place in my heart. As noted at the beginning, I also write for Goonhammer, covering Conquest, and if there's anything there that you want to go and check out, very much direct you towards that. It's a good site and we do some good writing. Finally, and just to reiterate something I said at the very beginning, as much as there have been some times during this video where I have been critical of the lists that are present, that's something that I have the luxury of doing, being able to see all of them in context and know with kind of absolute clarity what the Hios metagame looks like. Everyone who was present at this event, just as a reminder, is a really good player. You've all done really well to qualify. You have all put in a tremendous amount of effort, and you're all very skilled. Well done, everyone who will be at Hios this weekend. I hope you have a fantastic time, and I wish you all the best of luck.